Turn it on its screen.
Yeah.
I'll cover them all.
Hi, can I have your attention, please, up at the front? Hello? If you would like to make public comments on this item, can you hear me? We're ready to get started for the meeting, so if everyone could please take a seat. So we're ready to get started. If everyone can please take a seat. Thank you. If you're interested in making a public comment, the speaker cards are located in the back of the room. Everyone will be given 3 minutes to speak. If you could please complete the speaker card, and you can drop it off here in front of the clerks.
Lights are feeling a skin position or something here. Yeah. Darlene, good to see you. Good.
Good evening. I'm Mike Romer, MOFD Board President. I want to welcome everybody here today. All our elected
We just want to make sure your microphone.
6 inches. One of the things that Marcia is going to remind everybody, including myself, is that we need to identify ourselves and speak within about 6 inches of a microphone. We had some challenges the other night when we had our MOFD board meeting, and I hope we can overcome these. I want to welcome all our elected officials. I want to welcome all the present members of the audience and everybody participating remotely. At this time, I'd like to call the meeting to order and ask for a roll call.
And so before we take a roll call, just real quick, just for the audience, the Moraga-Orinda Fire District Board President, Mike Romer, will be chairing the meeting. For the elected officials, if you could please speak clearly and directly into your microphones, just to ensure that all remarks are captured accurately for the minutes and for the audio recording. If you could please state your name when you're making your comments, that will assist when the minutes are being produced. Also, for those that are listening just by audio, they will know who's making the comments. And the time is 6:03. And I will start with the Moraga-Orinda Fire District roll call. Director Danziger.
Present.
That worked.
Director Jex.
Here.
Director Jorgen.
Here.
Vice President Hassler.
Here.
President Romer.
Here.
Okay, for the Orinda City Council, Councilmember Riley,
Here.
Councilmember Miller,
Here.
Councilmember Iverson,
Here.
Vice Mayor Malkani,
Here.
and Mayor G.
Here.
Okay, for the town of Moraga, Councilmember Hillis,
Here.
Councilmember Sauce,
Here.
Vice Mayor Walke,
Here.
Mayor Onoda.
Here. And then
And
just
for the record, sorry, Councilmember Shapiro is absent.
I'd like to invite everyone to rise and recite with me the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So we have a special agenda tonight. Remind me, Marcia, are we taking public comment before or going right into agenda item 2, the community wildfire risk reduction measures?
And staff will give a presentation, then we will open public comment. We will then close public comment, and the elected officials will have discussion.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, members of the public who are here. The intent of tonight's meeting is to present really the state of the state when it comes to wildfire risk reduction measures, what is possible, how the work done in the district is viewed and valued by the risk transfer industry, specifically the insurance industry, and give our combined elected officials from the tri-agencies an opportunity to discuss this issue and discuss what potential actions we could take and provide direction to staff. To start that off, we have Nancy Watkins, who is the principal and consulting actuary with Milliman. She runs their San Francisco office where she manages an actuarial consulting practice that specializes in climate resilience, insurtech, and catastrophic property risk. She's also a Orinda resident and has been a tremendous resource as we have worked through over the last several years what right looks like when it comes to wildfire risk reduction. Nancy, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chief Whitaker. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
Well, I shockingly prepared a PowerPoint for y'all tonight. And Chief Whitaker is going to drive it for me. As he said, I am a consultant. I do work for a number of insurance industry trades, realtors industry, builders. I work for government agencies such as FEMA, several insurance departments. But today I'm speaking as a volunteer. All of my opinions are my own. So first slide. My focus this evening is going to be on setting the stage for your discussion of the Zone 0 regulation, give you a bit of background on the insurance market and where we are in the, I guess, the swirling bunch of things that have been happening to us recently, and what's the connection that I see between mitigation and insurance outcomes. So go 2 slides. So starting off with the California insurance market today, just to set the stage, there's really 3 pillars of a sustainable insurance market. The first is availability, and that is predicated on insurers being able to manage and measure the risk and being able to charge enough for the cost of risk transfer. The second is affordability. That means that consumers are able to afford the coverage at the price offered. And then reliability is that the insurers will be around to pay their claims and that the system is perceived as being predictable and stable by basically everybody. So we actually have problems in all 3 of those pillars in California. And so I will get into more detail about that next. So next slide. In California, we've got historical regulations. Can you advance one? Okay, I'll just keep talking. Advanced regulations that were set up in the 80s that required companies who are setting their total catastrophe premiums to base those premiums on the last 20 years of historical experience. So what that means is kind of a backwards looking view, and the insurers in California who were insuring wildfire and other risks were not allowed to use scientific catastrophe models for setting total premiums, and they were not allowed to pass along the cost of reinsurance, which, if you didn't already know this, it's insurance for insurance companies. They buy it to stay solvent and fulfill obligations in the case of a large event. So what happened with that backwards looking formula, as long as you don't have a lot of risk or the risk doesn't change very much, it actually is okay. But as we kind of know, in California, we do have a lot of wildfire risk, and the risk has changed. We've had cost inflation, we've had the buildup of homes in the wildland urban interface, and we've had Sorry, I'm getting a little distracted. We've had climate change making our fire seasons longer and hotter. And so as a result, the Oakland Hills fire, when it occurred, was kind of considered by many, a once in a lifetime event, but insurers became increasingly concerned that this could happen again. And then starting in 2017 and 2018, we obviously did have the Camp Fire and many other large fires that were really now urban conflagrations, not just wildfire burning trees, but lots and lots of properties that are damaged, which meant that backwards looking formula that we had, it actually kind of blew up on us. So we did a study of some of the top insurers in the state, and we looked at what the formula would say starting the 20 years ending in 2016. And that risk load, that total wildfire risk load went up by about 2.5 times when you just added the 2017 year. And then when you added one more year, it went up for a total of about almost 5 times. So essentially the formula that all the insurers were required to use, if you go up one more slide, we're there, was the reason that insurers were finally able to pass along rate increases. So essentially we had, okay, so it's like a 380% indicated increase between 2016 and 2018, just from this formula, which in terms of total premium across the state would have been 38%. That's on average. So for people in Orinda, we would have seen a much higher rate increase because we're in the much more wildfire exposed areas. So essentially the industry had made about 10 billion in profit for the 26 years ending in 2016, and they lost 20 billion in the next 2 years. So this sort of backwards looking, it'll all wash out over a 20-year period. It did not serve to prepare us for the risk that happened. So as if you go forward one day, as you've seen over the years since 2018, we've had companies pulling back and pulling back. And part of this is because they couldn't charge enough for the risk. Part of it is actually because they didn't understand the risk. And so you know that is true because there weren't a lot of non-admitted kind of insurers that don't have their rates regulated. In some markets, they'll come in and they'll charge more, but they'll offer the coverage. That didn't happen to us in California because the risk was perceived as being too high and too hard to predict. So I've got some headlines here. State Farm, obviously, we care a lot about them in Orinda because they used to, or they have written so much of our community in the past. They lost surplus and they had to choose between writing the policies that they were writing or pulling back. If they kept writing at the same level, they would have gotten downgraded. Their credit ratings would have gotten downgraded, and they might no longer be able to offer insurance that satisfies mortgage requirements to anybody. So if you think about surplus, it's like a pedestal underneath a table. The more you put on top of the table, the wider your pedestal has to be. And that's the way catastrophic risk works with a policyholder surplus. You need to have that surplus to make sure that your table stays upright. So this is the driver behind the availability crisis we've had, which turned into an affordability crisis because we had fewer companies competing for our business and more of us ending up in the FAIR plan. So now I want to move towards solutions. Go 2 slides. Chief Winokur and I both had the pleasure of participating on a committee that CAL FIRE convened called the Risk Modeling Advisory Work Group. And it was tasked with explaining how there's a relationship between modeling and mitigation and community resilience and figuring out what kind of recommendations to make to the state. So in this slide, I've got what we call the big picture. We were trying to figure out like how to put together a system that doesn't exist, where everybody's aligned and everybody actually understands what they need to do to get insurance, and insurance companies actually understand what we did. So, you guys can have copies of the slides afterwards. I'm not going to read it, but there's components of measuring the risk, which, as I said, insurers are having a really hard time understanding the changing wildfire risk. So we need more science and data in order to do a better job of that. And then we need to communicate the risk to our communities and people making decisions, not only through insurance price signals and underwriting signals and catastrophe models, but also through fire protection codes, which you're concerned about, building codes, land use, maintenance, and then prioritizing the mitigations that matter, the ones that are going to give you the most bang for your buck, and then capturing the information about what you did and feeding it back into future measurements. That's where we get this continuous improvement that's going to help us drive down the risk curve. Next slide. So other solutions that are happening, all of these are partial things that are all supposed to feed towards a better system for everyone. The California Insurance Commissioner issued his Safer from Wildfires framework with 10 components, which pretty much followed the Wildfire Prepared Home standard that the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS, put out. But basically, he listed out 10 things and he required all insurers to reflect them in their rating plans, which basically means give a discount. One thing that I will say is the way that regulation was implemented is contrary to the science, which was tough for the insurance companies and because they actually understand that this is a system and fire is going to follow the weakest point of a house. And so to give a discount for every single thing as though each one was independent of the other is not exactly in keeping with the science, but they were required to put these filings in last April. They're just now being approved and so would tend to take effect over the next year. I think beyond that, though, the Commissioner Lara wanted to encourage availability. So next slide, he's implementing the sustainable insurance strategy, which has several components. The first is to require any insurer that avails themselves of some new tools to guarantee that they will expand writings in what they call distressed areas, which are basically higher hazard parts of the state and areas with more fair plan policies. They are going to start allowing forward-looking catastrophe models for that purpose that I told you they're not allowed for right now. They'll be allowing reinsurance, and they're going to be modernizing the FAIR plan. Just full disclosure, I'm working with the CDI on this right now, and so have been talking to insurers about that. I'm just telling you what's publicly available. I will say the insurers have stuck around in California. That we're competing with every other state. And all these rules that we had, other states don't have. And our risk was higher. So it was very difficult for insurers to stay in our market. This is keeping them in the market. And I truly believe that once the strategy is fully implemented, assuming that it's implemented well, which I do believe is going to happen, insurers are eager to submit filings and eager to start writing in more of these high-risk areas, hopefully Orinda and Moraga being on the list. But how do we make the premiums more affordable? That gets us to mitigation. Next slide. We need a lot of truths about mitigation to be re-examined. For people to think that the level of effort equals the level of efficacy, for people to think that it's only worth doing if I'm going to get a big discount that pays for me to do it. Those are truths that may not hold up in the future. I think we are needing a better strategy of community action to bend down the risk curve and bring back insurability. So one thing I would like to point out about the industry and their view on mitigation, next slide, they're very dependent on IBHS. This is a scientific, not a policy institute. They're just scientific research, but the industry funds them. And I think they trust them that they're doing good work. And so when IBHS issued the Wildfire Prepared Home standard, which I mentioned is similar to the Safer from Wildfires framework. Insurers really do think of wildfire prepared homes differently than that homes that don't meet those standards. Next slide. But the majority of the risk in a community, in our community, is not going to be dependent on what we do in our yard. It's going to be dependent on what happens around us. Whoops. I didn't mean to hit that. Next slide. So how do we keep our community from looking like this when there's a car fire on 24 or, lightning in Briones or some other thing that sparks a fire? Next slide. IBHS is working on the wildfire prepared neighborhood standard. So they're not going to be looking at a whole zip code like, Orinda or Moraga. They're going to be looking at neighborhoods within. And they are planning to release the details. They said this month, but this month doesn't have much longer. So I expect it'll probably be November, December. Most certainly, it's going to reflect some level of how many wildfire prepared homes are in your neighborhood and what else, how close together are your houses. We can't do anything about that. But then what kind of connected fuels do we have between the houses? And then mitigation outside the houses. So the details will be coming out soon. But insurance companies and catastrophe modelers are watching this wildfire prepared neighborhood standard as a way of really understanding how to separate the sheep from the goats. Like I told you, they will be motivated to write better policies in 2025. And I think IBHS's designation will make it easier for them to make those decisions of who to write. So next slide. One of the 70-something thousand policies that is getting non-renewed in 2024 is my house. And this is a picture of my husband and my son digging out Zone 0, uprooting our cocktail mint garden. We are working right now to make our house insurable so that when we come up for renewal in April, we will be perceived as being one of the best of the riskiest. I think it would be good for us in the room to try to do that for ourselves. And if we can collectively work together to do it for our community. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Next, we'll talk about how some of these things are being brought together with what we are doing now in the community, what we could do. And to be very clear, as far as stage setting, there's not a proposal before the elected officials here or the MLFD board. This is not, the changes that we are discussing are not the sort of things in this community that I believe one could just bring forward and announce this is how it shall be. This needs to be a collaborative, community-led process. And that was the intent of gathering the tri-agency meeting, was to give all of our elected officials an opportunity to speak for their constituents with regard to whether or not we have the appetite for enacting some changes that CDI has recognized as being valuable. So with that, I'll walk through a few slides. If there are any questions as I'm going through, please ask them. I'd be happy to answer any questions either during the presentation or at the end. And then obviously we'll have public comment and opportunity for more discussion amongst our elected officials. So there's been a lot of discussion about what has changed. Why is it that my home that has been here for a long time, and I have lived in the district since 1970 in some cases, and I've never had a problem before, what has changed? And really it's very simple. First is we've had a significant increase in vegetative fuel loading, that being combustive vegetation that can burn, largely because of the well-meaning but misguided exclusion of wildfire from the landscape starting around 1910. So as a matter of policy, we have gone with a suppression-first approach for 120 years now that has reduced the amount of naturally occurring fire, which means vegetation that would have otherwise been burned in an ecosystem that is in balance has remained on the landscape, which just carries it forward to a future year. And I would point out that at the same time, anyone who is working on this problem says that it is historical exclusion of fire that led to where we are now. And then we all pivot to how we can reduce the amount of fire by reducing ignitions and increasing our efficacy with regard to suppression. Right? So a suppression-first approach just carries that fuel over to a future day, which will probably occur when there's an ignition on a hotter, drier day in the future. Second thing, we've built in fire-dependent landscapes. In this area, the natural fire return interval is every 3 to 5 years, meaning this ecosystem in balance burned every 3 to 5 years, and 4 to 6 million acres burned every year in California. So if you remember back in 2020, when we thought we used words like apocalyptic and cataclysmic and unprecedented, that year we hit 4.2 million acres in California. So we just hit the bottom end of the historical range in that year. And we've built all these homes in these landscapes that are designed to burn, but we haven't designed the homes and the communities that surround those homes to receive fire. We also have increasing vapor pressure deficit, meaning not only is it hotter, but it is significantly drier. And we see a compression of the rainy season so that our vegetative fuels are available to burn for more months of the year, which means there are more of those Diablo wind days, so those dry, windy northeast days that we just experienced a couple days ago. We're exposed to more of those because more of them are occurring prior to the onset of seasonal rains. Because when we have a northeast Diablo wind event in February, we don't care because we are several inches of rain into the season. And it's noteworthy that in October 2018, right around now, when Paradise was burned in the campfire, that area was at -4 inches from the 30-year mean with regard to precipitation. So in a normal year, whatever that means at this point, the campfire never would have ignited because there would have been 4 inches of rain on the ground and everything would have been too wet to carry fire. And then lastly, we have increasing exposure to extreme weather days. So with fire, it is topography, weather, and fuel that make the risk, that represent how our community could be exposed to a fast-spreading fire. And without a dry, windy day, we simply cannot have fast-moving fire. It is a wind-driven fire is what where our risk lies, and we're now exposed to more of those days. So this is some data from our friends at the Marin Water District, because they have great records going back to the 1850s. And on your left, you see the amount of acres burned per year. And you see in those early years, before the industrialization of the firefighting response, before the establishment of the lookout towers in the 1920s, they regularly had large fire years, a lot of acres burned, an ecosystem in equilibrium. And as we got past the 20s and 30s and really accelerating in the 50s with the full industrialization of the firefighting response, we see the acres burned on the left dropping to very, very little. And on the right, we see the return interval, how frequently fire burned on the landscape. And we see that return interval getting pushed up to more and more years, up from as low as every 10 years in the 1850s to something more looking like 40 or 50 years in the current environment. So by excluding fire, we've taken our ecosystems out of balance. We also see increasing vapor deficit, and this is going to continue to go up and to the right as we move into a hotter, drier future, with climate change driving not only a drying trend, but the compression of our annual rains. So two things are happening. Not only are we having more fires, but we're seeing more structures lost per acre of fire, which is a combination of the speed with which fires are burning on those extreme fire weather days with high winds, and the increasing number of structures, particularly high density structures that are built in our fire dependent landscapes. And the way fire enters a community is really through three pathways. And the first pathway is a vegetation to vegetation wildfire. We think where one item of vegetation burns another, either through the ground component, which is direct flame transfer from one item to another, or through three-dimensional ember cast, where flaming brands, embers, sparks are carried aloft by winds. And when they land on a receptive fuel bed, i.e. dry grass, mulch, other things that will ignite and carry fire, they create new fires in their own right. And as that fire, that vegetation to vegetation fire, approaches the community, there's a moment of transition. And when that fire encounters a home that has vulnerabilities, that is not hardened, that has vegetation next to it, that does not have retrofitted vents, that has a non-Class A wood shake roof, or any of the other myriad of vulnerabilities that will allow fire to enter the structure can be ignited, which sets up our third pathway, which is structure to structure urban conflagration. And this is where it is no longer a wildfire. This is now one structure igniting another structure, and fire spreading through the community in a structure-to-structure basis. If the homes are within 50 feet, the structure separation distance is 50 feet or less, home A is very likely to ignite home B. Now, there's value with mitigations in that the distance that can be somewhat effective, but given enough time in the absence of a firefighting response, a home burning within another 50 feet of a home will ignite at given time. At less than 25 feet or less, structure separation, it is a certainty that one home burning will ignite the next in the absence of a firefighting response to disrupt that chain of ignition. So as a community, we're essentially all in this together because fire is opportunistic and it has a network effect. Every time it can find a vulnerability, it will exploit that vulnerability and then it will self-propagate. As many of you heard me say before, if you have a small hole in your roof and it is raining, you have a leak, not a flood. If you have a small hole in your vents, in any of the vulnerabilities that will keep fire out, you have a total loss, because one little bit of fire gets into the walls of the home, it will burn to the ground. And in doing that, the asset, the structure, becomes the peril, the thing that is capable of propagating fire to the adjacent structures. Now, the good news is we know how to mitigate all of these, but knowing and doing can be two very different things. So working with Nancy and her team from Milliman and the folks from CoreLogic, who their lead modeler was a district resident at the time, a couple of years ago, we did the study that's shown on the left, the Casualty Actuarial Society, that showed the value of mitigations throughout the community. And what it found, among other things, that if fewer than 30% of the homes within a contiguous block, and we're using about 100 homes here for demonstration purposes, if fewer than 30 homes in that block of 100 have carried out all of the mitigations, there is no value with regard to the reduction of risk. Because a home will ignite, 70 out of 30 have vulnerabilities, and then that home will overwhelm the mitigations that were intended to protect the adjacent homes from wildfire loss. Because wildfire loss is relatively low intensity, where a structure loss is much higher intensity. And an adjacent structure will overwhelm the wildfire-based mitigations that were put in place. And on the right was a second report they did, working with the town of Paradise, that took a look at the value of not only mitigations, but mitigations combined with buffers around the community. And the results of that show that if the buffers on the right, which calculated out to about 45,000 acres of treated area, if all of that work was done, you could reduce risk. And on the left, you see the baseline average annual loss per million in total insured value, which is the way of pricing risk in dollars. And the red areas, I'll just suffice it to say, that is bad. You don't want to be in a red area with a high average annual loss. And if they executed those 45,000 acres worth of buffers that you see on the right, we could see a significant reduction in risk. And you see that in some of those areas in dark blue on the left, it was up to a 65% reduction in risk, or over $3,000 if you denominate in dollars in average annual loss. So the execution of mitigations could bend down the curve and could reduce the risk significantly as it is priced by the actuaries. But the bad news is if you do nothing, the top left there is the 2040 scenario. If you do nothing, it gets much worse in time. And as we work deeper into this and we talk to the modelers who developed these, we determined that only 20% of the risk reduction could be achieved by exterior measures, by the creation of fuel breaks or those large treated areas that we showed on the first slide. So even treating 45,000 acres at a cost of $4,500 per acre with a 3 to 5 year return interval. So an extraordinary sum with running out forever with inflationary increases in cost. Even all of that work would still leave 80% of the risk in place. And that 80% of the risk reduction opportunities lie within the community. The creation of defensible space, the creation of home hardening, the separating homes so that they are not likely to ignite in the first place, so we don't have that initiation of the structure-to-structure conflagration loss in that third pathway we just talked about. And so how do we do that? So this is some testing done by IBHS a few years back. And the home on the left has got mulch around it. It's got some plants. It's got wood siding. It's got non-mitigated vents. And they blew embers at it from what they call the ember dragon for 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, the side on the left, that home is well on its way to being a total loss. Yet on the right, with just passive measures in place, you see they have the non-combustible ground cover. They have no vegetation near the structure. There's some treatments to the deck. Specifically, they used foil to seal the gaps where the decking meets the baseboards. The gutters are covered. The vents are 1/8 inch or finer, and it's non-combustible siding. And after 10 minutes of exposure, that home shows no potential for ignition. I'll attempt the greatest of all Zoom tricks to shift. All right, not there. And we see that if we let this run, this is the difference between a community that is prepared to receive fire and a community that is not. And in the community that's prepared to receive fire, these embers are not finding receptive fuel beds. And they're simply bouncing off the non-combustive siding and they're landing on the non-combustive ground cover and they can't go anywhere. And the punchline on this experiment is that this is conducted in Rock Island, South Carolina, which is about 45 minutes from Charlotte. I went back with Cal Chiefs a couple years ago to watch the testing. And in South Carolina, the humidity is far higher than it is here, I'll leave it to you to do the calculations. And that mulch was purchased from Home Depot several days before. And that mulch has not been curing in the sun for years, as the mulch in our community is. And those plants, they're boxwoods. They also buy them from Home Depot, and they return the ones that don't burn the next day. So they don't have the decadent component. They're not dried out. They don't have the accumulation of leaves and litter and needles and other things that would burn underneath them. This is another round of testing that was recently done as a demonstration with CAL FIRE in Sacramento. You can see that they created 2 sheds. One has got a non-combustible fence. It's got some non-combustible building features, and it's surrounded by non-combustible ground cover. And after a few minutes of having embers and fans blown on them, the home or the structure on the left is well on its way to ignition. And at about the 10-minute mark, we have 2 very different outcomes. And so this is really a summary, I believe, of what we can do as a community. As a community, we can choose to meet all the mitigations that are in place on the right, or we can choose to maintain the current state. But I will say that the current state looks much more like the shed on the left than the one on the right. And this is from the community of Batania in Chile. And you can see those homes are in an area that burned. About 18,000 homes burned during this fire, and over 100 lives were lost. And this community survived because they had carried out a series of defensible space and home hardening measures so that when fire blew through there, it blew around this community. It never ignited the initial structures that would have led to structure-to-structure separation. And what makes this particular case so remarkable is there was a complete absence of firefighting response. The firefighting resources coming out of Valparaiso and that area were completely overwhelmed by the speed and the size of the fires. And so this community stood and survived based on passive measures alone. And it was the creation of defensible space and home hardening before the fire, their pre-fire actions, that allowed them to have this outcome, while every home around there is currently being rebuilt. So what does that look like for us? And how is fire going to come into our community? So this, to get you oriented, there's Highway 24 down the middle. And you can see not only our community, but the large reservoirs to our north that serve as tremendously effective fire breaks, in that they are large non-burnable surfaces that will remain in place as long as East Bay mud keeps them full. This is a look at the underlying fuel layers. This is the Scottenberg 40 fuel layers that represent the type of vegetation that is present that is used by a fire spread model to determine fire spread. And here is the 2019 North Orinda shaded fuel break and some of our prescribed fire projects that show up as modifications or disturbances to the fuel layer that show where the work we have done is now being reflected in any models being run using the land fire data set, because our work has been integrated and is represented on the map. And here's what it looks like. And I'll say that this is deliberately chaotic because that's how fire spreads. So we have the potential for ignitions all over the place. And we have the potential primarily for a northeast wind event entering our community. And if we break that down to a specific area and where there is the continuity of homes, so that if fire were to enter the community from one of those vegetative pathways, where are there homes that have the appropriate continuity to surrounding homes that we could see structure to structure spread? Because if we have a fire that spreads the community and it encounters homes that are not connected to others, we could experience loss, but it would be very small scale. And that's exactly what happened during our only wildfire loss in August of 1988, when 5 homes burned in Lost Valley. When fireworks ignited fire at a base of a slope, it ran up the grass and it burned 5 homes. But it did not spread and become a community conflagration of the type that the insurance industry is pricing. So you see the areas in bright red where there's the potential for structure to structure spread. And what that looks like, if we take in a microcosm here around the Lafayette Reservoir, we have a number of pathways that can enter homes. And then the red continuity is where we have the potential for structure to structure transmission, where it is no longer a vegetation fire. It is now being carried with structures as the primary fuel. And here's an example of what that looks like from one of those entry points. And we quickly see that this fire is now spreading structure to structure, and that it is the presence of an adjacent structure that represents the risk to the home. So the key here is to prevent the fire from getting established in the community in the first place, because once we begin that structure to structure chain, defensible space and home hardening is not particularly relevant. And because of the density of the homes here, the primary spread mechanism will be structure to structure. Yet in other areas, and here we see just to the north of there, we see less continuity from the initial ignition, and we see embers as the primary driver. We get all of that downrange spotting where the embers are finding receptive fuel beds and the embers are now igniting structures that are inviting adjacent structures. So it speaks to the point, and there was a public comment submitted earlier today that was shared with our elected officials, speaking to how, well, if the mitigations are priced at the individual parcel, shouldn't this be voluntary so a resident can make an individual decision about whether they're willing to pay more for their insurance or they want to absorb the cost of of executing the mitigations. And what this example shows is that it's not an individual decision, it's a community decision, because your neighbor's decision to not carry out these mitigations threatens your home. And the way insurance is priced is certainly not at the parcel level. And as Nancy alluded to, that the mitigations are priced at the parcel level is more a quirk of the regulatory environment and how insurance is sold than the fire science. Because if we were allow people to select, I'm doing this voluntarily, well, then their decision implicates their neighbor's survival. And I think a good example of this is traffic signals, where we all make a decision to stop at a red light and to stop at a stop sign, because that inconvenience now allows us all to flow freely through the shared space of the intersection. I think it's a good way of looking at this as well, is that it is a network and everything is related. So what does that look like with regard to CDI's Safer from Wildfire framework? So as Nancy alluded to, there are three elements. There's work that can be done on and around your home. There's work that can be done as a community organization, those specifically being Firewise, of which we now have 40 in the community, and being a fire mitigation community, a risk reduction and mitigation community, of which MOFD was recognized. And the last is, which is pending, and the IBHS release will move this ball forward very much, is the presence of mitigated homes in clusters, so that the degree to which one home could ignite the other. And that's what's coming and coming soon. So the specific elements that CDI has advanced are Class A fire rated roof. So we have most of our homes have a Class A roof covering, and any new homes or major remodels in the WUI fire area or the very high fire hazard severity zone require a Class A roof assembly. A 5-foot ember resistant zone around structures, which essentially excludes anything that will burn to include wood fences. No non-combustive siding within 6 inches of the bottom of the wall. There's a couple of ways to address that, one of which is to bring the dirt around the home down, so you don't have to raise the siding, you can lower the surrounding earth. Ember and fire resistant vents, which the fire district has been giving away through our grant program for the last several years. Enclosed eaves, clear vegetation from under decks, sheds and outbuildings at least 30 feet away from the structure, trees and brush trimmed in accordance with the MOFD Ordinance 2303, which requires a 6-foot air gap, and then Firewise communities and our local community risk reduction activities. The most important element, and the one that is missing from our current regulations, is the 5-foot ember resistant zone around structures. And when we discussed this back as part of the 2019 Fire Code adoption cycle, it was very clear at that time there was not the community support to enact it, and we adopted the 2-foot out, 1-foot up compromise, which we believed was better than nothing. With regard to insurance, it gets us 0 credit. There's simply no credit for standards that fall below what has been established here. But moreover, because what we are doing is unique to the fire district. Now, in fairness to us, when we adopted our ordinances, these programs did not exist. But because what we're doing is unique to the fire district, and there are 573 fire departments and districts in the state of California, it is simply impossible for an underwriter or an insurer to understand what we are doing here. So we end up with this disconnect where our team conducts thousands of inspections per year, and every one of those homes is compliant with MOFD Ordinance 2303 and 2408 by the end of the year. And it means nothing to the insurance industry because we are using a different standard than they are. And so we're expending all of this effort, and our residents are spending a tremendous amount of time and a lot of money complying. And then they discover that the test is being scored to a different key. And the opportunity, and we had a call today with 4 deputy commissioners from the California Department of Insurance. And the question we posed to them was, if MOFD adopted these elements, the ones that are not part of the building code, so the things that have to do with combustible material around the structures and some of these other parts that are not building code requirements, if we adopted that by reference, and so that our inspections now said, you have met compliance with MOFD ordinance, whatever it may be, for the purposes of property transfer and our annual inspections. And on the back, it said, you have met these elements of the CDI Safer from Wildfire framework. Boom, 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 boom. Fire chief's signature shall attest. Would a resident be able to submit that to their broker or carrier and access the discounts that are now included in the rate filings that are coming in and being processed by CDI, that CDI is using to evaluate and approve the significant rate increases that are coming. And their answer was absolutely. We could absolutely conduct inspections to this standard, and that would allow a resident to engage in the conversation with their insurer. Now, they were quick to say the amount of the discount is widely variable depending on the carrier, which one of these things, and a bunch of other factors. So there is no certainty here with regard to what that number would be. But there is certainty that admitted carriers in California have to recognize these discounts. And if they are taking part in the forward-looking CAT model use that was associated with these, they have to have included these in their rate filings. And a resident who has done them has to be given those discounts. And so from our perspective, the thought was, if we are out of alignment with industry and we're out of alignment with the regulators at CDI, we're going to potentially create an awful lot of confusion where our residents are going to seek to comply with all of these elements. And at the same time, we're going to be conducting inspections on their home and their neighbor's home to a different standard. And if we're going to be going through all the work of an inspection process and our residents are going to be going through all the work of complying, for just a little bit more, we could be in alignment with the program of record from the regulator of the industry we're most concerned about. Because wildfire is a threat to our community, and we would love to see things done that would make our community more resilient and allow it to be in or adjacent to the inevitable future wildfire without experiencing catastrophic loss. But that is an abstract future thing. And our efforts are largely being graded through the pricing of risk and the availability of insurance on an annual basis here. And if we align to that thing, the annual availability and pricing affordability of insurance, that feels like a far better place for our efforts to be expended rather than on something that is site-specific to us and is not understood by industry. Now, to be very clear, when we brought this up in 2019, it was crystal clear that the community was not ready for that. And that may remain clear that the community is not ready for it. But I have watched carefully as we have limped into the beginning of a large-scale insurance crisis, noting that 22.7% of all policyholders in Orinda were non-renewed back in May. There is an opportunity to do something that is now aligned with what industry and what the regulators agree are the elements that should be included in their rate filings and bring bona fide discounts. And there is a very good possibility that in time, as the community standard is built out and adopted, having clusters of mitigated homes to this standard will be scored as part of a community risk reduction effort in a way where the sum will far exceed the inputs, right? A single home doing this reduces risk and may result in some discounts in a formulaic manner, but it isn't going to be earth-shattering. But when we get to 70 to 85% of the homes within a contiguous block, a conflagration unit, if you will, an area where homes could ignite other homes or there's continuity of structures as fuel, we can see exponential increases in risk reduction, rising as high as found in the Paradise Report as 78% of the baseline risk. And so we have the ability to bend the curve. And the question I keep coming back to is, if this is a crisis, and this crisis has the ability to affect the resale of our homes and our ability to exist as a community as we know it now, are those boxwoods and other things that close to the home, are they that important? Because I don't see how this can be both a crisis and not important enough to suggest a change in our landscaping, which I would point out we have done before when we removed grass and other things in response to drought. So we have done this before. We've responded to climate-based emergencies, and I believe we have the opportunity to do it again. Now, that said, if this is not something the community is ready for, we're under no pressure and no obligation to do anything. So this is not to say that this has to happen right now, but there is an opportunity to make it happen. And each year, we conduct thousands of inspections. And here you see the outcomes of those inspections. And those inspections are done in clusters so that we can see the benefits of risk reduction across an area. As I said before, we're using the wrong key. Our tests are being scored using a different metric than the one we're using for our inspections. And I understand that 5 feet of non-combustible is different than 2 feet of non-combustible, but it's not that much different. And we're doing most of the work now, and we're getting essentially none of the benefit. And there'll be an opportunity to get the benefit with doing slightly more. I will hold there if there are any questions, or if they're not, we could open for public comment. We're waiting for public comment, sir.
I'm Darlene G. I'm the current mayor in Orinda. My question, Chief, is I understand the checklist. I understand the discount. I understand everything you said. What I'm curious about, though, is there's still no obligation for an insurer to offer a policy at all, correct? I mean, there's nothing that if they do want to offer you the policy, all of that is in place, but they have the right to not offer you a policy, correct?
That's correct with one caveat, which is, as Nancy alluded to, in exchange for the use of cap models, the insurers agreed to write 85% of the policies in fire distressed areas. And we did not qualify as that, but that had more to do with the quirk of the LRA maps dating to 2007 than anything having to do with the risk here. It also has to do with the percentage of residents who are in the FAIR plan. My guess is that number is going to rise dramatically as the State Farm and other non-renewals kick in. So there's a good chance that we will be included in the distressed policy area in the future. But in the current environment, we are not included in that, and there's no other obligation for carriers to write here. And capital will seek higher rents. It will go places where they think they can get a better return on investment. And today they've determined that the investment is simply, the ROI here is simply too low.
And do you have an educated guess as to how long before we would be classified in the distressed area? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? Is it?
Well, the LRA maps will be, CAL FIRE is committed to releasing those in January, which is long overdue. The current one's date to 07 in draft, 09 final. That will level set the disparity between local responsibility area maps that date to 09 and the SRA maps that were updated earlier this year. So that we would expect to see a lot more red, very high, and then the whole new category of high. So most of the community will be in a fire hazard severity zone when CAL FIRE releases those. And we will see, I think, inevitably a significant increase in FAIR plan that is likely to put us into that category. I would say as soon as 6 months from now is an educated guess.
Okay, thank you.
Inga?
Oh, thank you, Chair Romer. So, Chief, thank you. And
This
so-
is Inga Miller.
Oh, yes, I apologize. Thank you. Inga Miller, I'm one of the council members for the city of Orinda. And so if Orinda, at the point at which it sounds like you feel pretty comfortable that Orinda is going to be determined to be a fire distressed area. So at that point, there also would not there's a requirement on insurance companies to write 5% of their policies in fire distressed areas. Is that correct?
The requirement is to write up to 85% of the policies in those areas.
I'm not following that, how that works. So that there would be 85% of all homeowners in those areas would have coverage, or maybe you could describe it a little more.
You want to, Nancy?
You have to come in like. Again, for purposes of identification, Nancy Walker is approaching the podium in order to help us out with this question.
And the purpose of my question is then going to be to understand, to Mayor G's question, at that point, how these requirements relate to the obligation of an insurer to provide insurance at that point.
Okay. As I understand the rules, the main requirement is to write market share in distressed areas, which is at least 85% of your market share in non-distressed areas. So sort of level out your market share as an insurer so that you're more balanced across distressed versus non-distressed, which, as you are sort of thinking, wow, 85% of your policies, well, I'll get insurance. No, that's not actually how it'll work. Unfortunately, the 5% rule is some smaller companies or startups have a different rule that's to increase their writings in distressed areas by 5% a year. And then to Mayor G's question, no insurer is likely to be told that they have to write a particular policy that does particular things. If California were to do that, I expect that the availability issue would get much worse than it is now. and we would have a run for the exits because insurers have to be able to continually look. Remember that pedestal that I told you in the table? They have to look at where things are on the table and how much is stacked up. And so if everybody in, I don't know, the Orinda Downs neighborhood all of a sudden got religion and got very, very well mitigated, no insurer could be forced to quote policies for every one of those homes. And so they need to be able to select the risks, but they want to write the better risks. And I think and they will finally be incentivized to drastically increase their market share in distressed areas. I actually think the rules that CDI put out this year are in draft, they might have already changed them by now because Chief Winokur went and commented on why was Orinda left out. So it may be faster than 6 months. I hope that helps.
Steve?
Thank you. Steve Wallachy of Moraga. Chief, question, are there any communities that are ahead of us in terms of adopting and implementing Zone 0, such as in Marin County, that we could use as a model and learn from their experiences?
Marin County is not. Paradise has. Town of Paradise adopted. It's in the municipal code now. Zone 0 requirements for all annual inspections, property transfers, and AB 38, inclusive of decks and chimney vent screen, somewhat randomly.
So maybe my question should be augmented and say existing communities that are not rebuilding.
I'm not aware of any.
Okay, thanks.
Just to
Steve?
follow up to that, what about?
Again, this is,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Steve Danziger, MOFD. What about in communities that are in state controlled areas or state response areas? Do
No,
they
sir.
require the 5-foot zone and these other requirements or?
No, so the legislator directed the California Board of Forestry, which is different than CAL FIRE but related, to establish a Zone 0 requirement no later than January 1st, 2023, and write the associated regulations. That would have kicked in Zone 0 mitigation requirements in LRA very high fire hazard severity zones and SRA all fire hazard severity zones, with both MOFD, other fire districts that have SRA in their jurisdiction, and CAL FIRE, who conducts hundreds of thousands of inspections per year to enforce that. Of note, no regulations have been published, despite now being almost 2 years overdue. So at some point, the Board of Forestry may publish a regulation. I think that's an open question, when. And if that were to happen, that would require that regulation in whatever form to apply all the other places that state minimum fire safety laws apply.
Go ahead. Did you want to go first?
Kerry?
Kerry Hillis, Moraga Town Council. Just a few questions as it relates specifically to Moraga. So I think we heard that in 6 months, Orinda could be considered a fire distressed community. I also know that the insurance cancellation rates in Orinda have been significantly higher than in Moraga. Would Moraga also fit in the category of a fire distressed community in 6 months?
Probably not. Lower rates and less fire hazard severity zone.
Then the next question is, so you also talked about fire modeling projections for, I believe it was 2040 or 2050. Do the models show a point where Moraga in the next 20 to 30 years might shift in that designation?
I don't know. It's possible, but Moraga has some advantages, specifically Lafayette and Orinda being to its north. And since our risk is represented by a northeast wind day, for fire to get to Moraga, it would have to burn through those communities and to get there at scale. Now, that said, there is significant potential for ember wash. If a fire were to become established on the north side and bump to the south side of 24 in Lafayette, if you run a southwest vector from there, very quickly you get to a lot of Moraga. And where at sky high, where we see that significant elevation change, that will have a lofting effect that will kick embers up and cause them to fall out of solution as they rain over the downtown, as it were.
So in our community, it sounds like there would be less of an incentive to try to receive the insurance discounts, though there may still be some neighbors that, or our neighborhoods that might consider a zone zero as something they want to explore. Could you also go into the discounts that MOFD offers to enact some of these modifications to harden your home if the insurance discount isn't as big of a mover for you?
I think you're conflating two different things, sir. That because of the recent non-renewal rate and the presence of very high fire hazard severity zones, as we anticipate the new maps, Orinda is likely to qualify for inclusion as a fire distressed area, meaning that carriers, as Nancy said, it's more complex than that, but just reading their public statements, the major carriers would be required to cover at least 85% of properties in distressed areas, and smaller companies would have to increase their writings by at least 5% per year. That requirement is unlikely to apply to Moraga, i.e. the positive side of the sustainable insurance plan of the commissioners. That said, the risk is being priced on a regional scale, and the risk that Moraga is being priced for, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but anecdotally I'm aware of quite a few non-renewals in Moraga as residents discover that they are not being covered. That risk can be bent down through the same mechanisms as it can in Orinda, which is the presence of mitigations at scale. The decision to apply discounts for the completion of mitigations applies to all policyholders in California if their carrier has them, including the rate filing, some of those details. But there's nothing specific to Orinda that would cause those discounts to only apply to Orinda carrier policyholders. They would apply equally to Moraga policyholders. Just the part that is distinct to Orinda is is more likely to be included in the fire distressed area and be the beneficiary of the requirement to write more policies than Moraga is.
And last question is that because one of our neighbors is not in the district, Confire handles fire response for Lafayette, and it's either Confire or Cal Fire handles response outside of the Moraga boundaries, which is where it sounds like most people would have to evacuate if fires were coming from the Lafayette Orinda direction. How coordinated are we with Lafayette, Confire, Cal Fire on their shifts and mitigation strategies as well? And if I'm complaining things, please correct me.
Yes, sir. So Cal Fire has the primary fiscal responsibility for the suppression and prevention of fire in SRA, but they have no presence in this county. So the fire district boundaries extend to the Alameda County boundary to the south, to the Oakland border to the west, and until they bump up against Confire and San Ramon Valley Fire Protection District to the east. So those areas outside of Moraga are still very much within the fire district and perfectly coordinated because we treat all of the administrative units the same. We have seamless integration with Confire, Cal Fire, and San Ramon Valley on a response basis. We regularly, on a daily basis, we trade resources back and forth across the border. That said, Lafayette is under a different fire prevention program that Confire runs. And so anything that this group could talk about or could consider would be limited necessarily to the 62 square miles of the fire district. That said, and there's several representatives from adjacent agencies here tonight, if MOFD were able to successfully enact something along these lines and experience beneficial outcomes in the form of discounts or increased access and affordability, I'm highly confident that others would follow. But one of the things we're stuck with here is that everyone agrees that the status quo is failing and no one wants to go first. And so we have potential to go first, should that be our direction. And I'm confident others would follow, being informed by what we have done. But to your point, seamless integration within the fire district, operational integration within Lafayette, and a hope, and I know hope is not a plan, but a hope that Lafayette would follow our lead if we were to do such a thing and it were to go well.
Thank you.
Renata, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Renata Sauce from the town of Moraga. Dave and Nancy, thank you for excellent presentations. Dave, I have a two-part, actually it's two questions, they're not related. The first question is, under the most aggressive timeline of implementation of Zone Zero, what would that look like and when would it affect property owners in our two communities? And then Secondly, you very persuasively demonstrated how community and collective action is almost more important than individual action. And I was wondering if you could just very briefly encapsulate for us what you are doing to encourage community action, and is there any thinking about devoting more resources to encouraging that?
Let's take that in order. Great questions, ma'am. First question, how, if we moved aggressively, which I certainly am a fan of pretty much all things, if we were to move aggressively, we could, as soon as December, have adopted a ordinance requiring these things through the ordinance process. The logical implementation of that ordinance, though, would be June 1st, when we begin our annual inspection regime. I'll note that it was part of the 2019 fire code cycle that we banned juniper within 10 feet of a road, and we still have open cases today. So it's taken us 4 years. So the administrative action could be done as late as or as soon as the December MOFD board meeting. Implementation as soon as June, as far as actual boots on the ground out conducting inspections. But this is likely to be a multi-year project. And what we found this year, to your second question, 7 years into this journey of wildfire risk reduction, 78% of the homes we inspected this year were non-compliant on initial inspection. So 7 years of outreach and education has netted us a 22% compliance rate through voluntary actions. And our failure on initial inspection for homes that passed last year was only marginally better. And that's across firewise, non-firewise, all other factors being, HOAs, all other factors being equal. So to your second question, 7 years ago, we had 2 part-time hourly employees, district aides, that went when people asked for information, went and shared some information and spent most of their time driving those little Ford Rangers around the fire district. That year, we issued 35 citations. And so that meant 35 inspections, really, and some number probably in the low hundreds of resident contacts. We now have 6 full-time staff with an additional inspector who does a lot of the property transfer inspections. And then the fire marshal and myself are heavily involved. So I'd say 7 FTE working on this full-time. We are at capacity. We're also, with regard to more people would not necessarily be helpful at this point. We do between 2,000 and 3,000 inspections, depending on the year. My sense is that's about capacity of what the community will take. The fire district can only have so many people that are angry standing in line waiting to get in when the door opens in the morning before we've reached our number. And what we find is when we did more inspections, we quickly got overwhelmed, and then you would see gaps. And those gaps would result in a resident who, and our residents are smart, informed, and engaged, would quickly identify that either we had deviated from the process, so there was a mistake, or we had failed to carry out multiple and redundant contact attempts that they felt were reasonable under these circumstances, and then accounting for all of the variety of things that make up a diverse community such as ours. We have a shocking number of people who are gone for the entire summer and come back from wherever they have been legitimately aggrieved that the citation process moved forward in their absence, with the letters stacking up by the door. So my sense is that our current staffing levels are about right for this. We have obviously our home hardening grant program where we give out the vent mesh and the gutter guards. The city and the fire district, we have as many as 3 chippers on the street most of the year, out doing an awful lot of chipping. We're doing a lot of pile burning in the off months for large property owners. And we're closing out our 3rd large state-funded fuel break project that I really don't believe is. We've done a lot of good things in the fuel breaks, and knowing what I know now, that's not how I would have done it. I would have pulled those resources into the community because that's where most of the risk reduction opportunities lie.
Thank you, Chief, and thank you, Nancy. This is terrific. I wish everybody in Moraga was here. I'm sorry, I'm Teresa Onoda, Mayor. One thing that I hear over and over again, and I would love for you to answer this as best you could. If there is a fire, or when there's a fire, let's say in Lafayette or Orinda, and the people evacuate to Moraga, and Moraga is a cul-de-sac. So how do you deal with that, and how do I help people to understand, and for me to understand what that looks like?
With the caveat that I'm 70 days from retirement, so I'm unencumbered and can speak my mind. It doesn't look good is the takeaway, right? There's simply nothing, no way to sugarcoat the limited surface street capacity, the large number of people in a community that was never laid out with its current state in mind. And obviously additional construction, voluntary mandated, et cetera, the number of people part gets worse. So from my perspective, deferring, of course, to PD and to the town and to the city, since evacuation is a municipal function, not a fire district function. From my perspective, the absolute best solution is to harden our community so that fire is unable to spread, so we never have to execute the evacuation. Because the time and effort required to create fire-adapted, resilient homes that were reduced or eliminated the vulnerabilities is a fraction of the time and effort it would take to expand the roads, build skyways, tunnels, whatever gondola system, whatever options are available to try to improve our ability to get people out. It is so simple to do, yet so hard in concept, right? But so hard to execute with regard to defensible space and home hardening. It is a constant source of beat head against wall amazement that understanding that we have issues like that and we have the insurance crisis and we have a clear mandate to take action, yet we're not quite ready as a community. So from my perspective, the best thing we can do about evacuation is to harden our community so that fire is unlikely to spread, and that as fire spreads, and to be clear, everything we're talking about, there's a design limitation. There will become a point that there is more fire than the mitigations are capable of stopping. But in this area, we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to firefighting response, right? It's somewhere at around the 90 to 120 minute mark, we will run out of places to park all of the fire engines because the world is coming and we will have engines everywhere. And if we can slow the fire spread during those first critical minutes or hours, while we are aggregating the effective firefighting response and we are pulling residents out of the areas where we need to actively fight fire, we will win. And the presence of these mitigations slows a fire. Without continuity of fuels, fire cannot spread rapidly. And if we can slow it, that time will buy us a tremendous increase. I mean, hockey stick up and to the right increase in firefighting resources very, very quickly. Certainly.
Go ahead, Brandon.
Follow-up question to that. I'm sorry, Brandon Iverson, Orinda City Council. What I recall from the Orinda conversation about this in late 2023 that was so controversial was not just Zone 0, but it was very comprehensive about people's entire landscaping. So the barrier to the street, neighbors, shrub spacing, to the point that people were worried about erosion control. And so this is incredibly persuasive if we were just talking about Zone 0. But I'm now confused when we talk about being a resilient community. If you could connect the dots, please, between Zone 0 and all of the other prevention measures.
Great question. The presentation tonight was presuming that all of the other prevention measures that are in place remain in place, and that Zone 0 is essentially the missing piece that completes the puzzle, because the defensible space and home hardening measures that are in place from the structure out, from the property line in, have the effect of compartmentalizing the community so that ground fire or an ember-caused fire that's now spreading as a ground fire will encounter this mosaic of varied age class fuels that will prevent it from spreading from parcel to parcel. But unfortunately, the missing piece is that if we're trying to protect the home, which is our goal here, the ultimate vulnerability is the home itself. And this other work we have put in place and that the residents are carrying out will be very effective at reducing fire spread throughout the vegetative parts of the landscape. But the homes are still vulnerable. And so when we get into the areas where homes have tight SSD, structure separation distances of 50 feet or less, or the home itself is vulnerable, all of the work we have required around the perimeter, that the fire just flies right over it. So I think a good example would be maybe a football analogy where if we're trying to protect concussions, we should wear the big Marvin the Martian padded helmet thing that they're wearing now, because they tried rule changes and officiating and so forth, and it wasn't effective. If we want to protect the head, we should protect the head. In this case, if we want to protect the home, the missing piece that connects all the stuff we have in place is the existing vulnerability presented by Zone 0, so that if you've created the fuel break around your large parcel or you've created the defensible space within 100 feet of the home, if you have things right next to the house that will burn, specifically mulch and other combustive ground cover, an ember will fly right over all of those other areas that have been mitigated and can ignite a home right next to the house. But this is definitely a belt and suspenders problem, that if we just did the work at zone 0, it's likely that fire would spread across the rest of the parcel and could find ways either into the home, produce more embers, or spread onto adjacent parcels. And if we only do the work that we require now, the homes remain vulnerable. So they all come together to a comprehensive risk reduction measure that prevents the rapid spread of ground fire from parcel to parcel and protects the homes from ember-carried fire that could ignite either the home or the vegetation immediately around it.
Lathika Mulkani, Vice Mayor Orinda. Thank you, first of all, Chief Winokur and Millman, for a really excellent, informative presentation. In the discussions with the CDI deputy commissioners yesterday, or with all the insurance representatives you've spoken to, is there any discussion about tying the IBHS or CDI adoption of these measures to renewing or writing new policies, right? Either on a mandatory or even on a voluntary pilot basis, because you understand that what we're hearing is, you mean I could do all this and I'm still with the FAIR plan and a non-admitted carrier, and, you know.
Absolutely. And just like fire has a network effect, so does insurance. Every policy that's written, that means a proportionally larger share of the FAIR plan and a whole bunch of other things going on. That said, I've met with 3 carriers who are interested in pilot projects. Now, a carrier cannot write all of the policies in a given area, but it'd be a good start. And I met with IBHS when Nancy and I were at a meeting with them in Arizona last week, and they're interested if we had any pilot communities that would be potential candidates for the wildfire prepared community or neighborhood designation. But the problem that we are running into is that the carriers have said, well, show me a neighborhood that has done these things. And the neighborhoods have said, show me a carrier who will give me certainty. And we remain in this standoff where neither party is happy with the status quo. I would suggest just a simple review of economics. Capital is portable. That money can seek higher rents in other places. Our homes are not. So we are the ones with more to lose here. I think we need to be the moving party. And if we as a community carry out those mitigations, there's no guarantees, because this is the future, but it is highly reasonable that carriers would seek to write policies in this area, because this is a community. They want our coverage. They want the homes, they want the cars, they want the umbrella policies, they want the full package of the demographics of this community. So if we give them the reasons to write policies here, I'm confident that they will. And I've had a number of discussions with carriers, but what we've run up to is I can't find a block of 100 homes that are willing. I've even settled for 30 if they had some separation around them. I haven't been able to find 30 homes that would meet the IBHS wildfire prepared program. And I've spent a lot of time recruiting, but we have not yet had any takers yet. So I offer that to say there's some real limits to what voluntary measures can do here. It's noteworthy that 2 years into the IBHS wildfire prepared program being available, we have 0 homes that meet the IBHS wildfire prepared home certification in the fire district, despite many people calling the providers saying, hey, I'm interested in more information.
Oh, is somebody else? Councilman Riley, go ahead.
Janet Riley, Orinda City Council. I'm wondering about the 5-foot rule. Is that like the minimum to create a defensible space, or are we going to in a couple of years say, no, it really should be 10 feet, you know?
I don't know what the science will say in the future.
What does the science say about supporting 5?
5 feet is the 7 at the corners, but no one's using that. So the science is very clear that 5-foot non-combustible zone reduces the home's probability of ignition dramatically, all other factors being equal. And 5-foot non-combustible is the element that's included in the CDI rate filings and the IBHS wildfire prepared home. There may in the future, potentially, there could be that being spread to a greater distance, but really the distance as shielding is one way to approach the problem. The other way to approach it is reduce the amount of stuff that will burn that's 5 feet from the home. So I would be very surprised to see the 5-foot non-combustible zone extend, because the thinning and trimming and limbing and spreading things out and reducing the volume of fuels farther than 5 feet are highly effective. Just within that 5-foot area, anything that will burn is associated with increased structure loss rates.
It just seems like the fire can just jump way farther than 5 feet. So I just,
It can't, with respect. Yeah, the fire needs a combustive substrate. It needs a medium across which it will burn. And so if you were piling eucalyptus logs in big slash piles 5 feet from the home, then yes, the home would burn. But the testing is done with wood cribs. So think of a bunch of 2x4s stacked up in Jenga blocks and then ignited. And at 5 feet, homes become the defensible space, or sorry, the home hardening measures become very effective if the burning thing is removed 5 feet from the home. So it really, the dose makes the poison. It's the quantity of fuels and their configuration within near the home. Our existing requirements don't allow large piles of things that'll burn 6 feet from a home. Right? Our defensible space goes out to 100 feet, zone 1 going 5 to 30 feet, being more restrictive. So our existing regulations nest very nicely with a 5-foot non-combustible. It's intended as a systems approach.
Darlene, go ahead.
Darlene G. Orinda. I realize this is a much smaller subset of things, Chief, but with the zone 0, 0 to 5, would it apply to structures other than residential?
So the answer to that is it depends. It can be whatever we want. The fire science is universal and immutable. If there is a building and there's stuff within 5 feet of it that can burn, it has a higher probability of structure loss. That said, just as we are under no pressure to do anything other than our own, we're also under no obligation to do anything specific. So should we choose to slice and dice this into a variety of ways, it could apply to or not apply to whatever carve-outs that we're seeing fit. I would say from a regulatory environment, it is very challenging when we have different standards because people get very confused. They heard or they saw something else, and then they really struggle to understand why a different standard is being applied to them.
Go ahead, Danziger.
Steve Danziger, MOFD. So as for longtime residents, as myself and many of you here and up here as well, we've seen great changes in the last 7 years, mainly correspond with Chief Winokur's arrival here. You know, as the chief just said, a large majority of property owners are not in compliance with our present ordinance. And most residents find even the 2-foot zone to be quite onerous. And, you know, looking at what CDI recommends, I mean, besides the 5-foot ember-resistant zone, I mean, they have other items on there like moving sheds and buildings and enclosing eaves, other things that I think would be much more onerous. And so what I'm thinking is, and it probably wouldn't be MOFD, but it would be the town or the city could possibly, I think, adopt these type of ordinance for new construction or major remodels, which, you know, in Orinda especially, and Moraga as well, I see a lot of, you know, houses being flipped or houses being torn down and brand new residences. I visited a neighborhood today where they tore down a 3-bedroom rancher, and now it's like a 5-bedroom, 2-story home. And I think that, you know, maybe it would be the city managers who would have to respond, but I think it probably wouldn't be MOFD, but it could be the town and the city that could change their codes to require these type of conditions for new construction or remodels, and it would be a start. And if you know the board and if our different organizations don't feel that this is something we would want to pursue right now, maybe that would be a way to start.
I just remind that we should be questions only at this point, so we have opportunity for public comment before substantive board discussion. I would just, I believe there's a question there. The fire district regulates the elements of the building code, specifically 7A, that apply to home hardening and defensible space, irregardless of whether it's new construction or that part of the building permit comes to the fire district, not to the city and town.
Go ahead. Gary Hillis, down in Moraga. Just a follow-up question on, has the fire district explored if if Zone Zero were implemented, what type of outreach might be necessary? Potentially hiring a PR firm or something to that effect to help get the message out? The sense that I'm getting, especially from the public comments and even from confusion of those of us here, just in trying to piece through all of this information, is that a whole lot more education is needed with the public just to understand. I think everyone is terrified of fire. That's one of the biggest things that I'm sure all of us have heard as we've talked to people in our communities. In Moraga, folks, I can tell you, because of the nature of our community being a cul-de-sac, people are very concerned about fire risk. But I'm not getting the sense that people are sold on the urgency of Zone Zero. And that strikes me as more of a PR problem than one that we can just legislate, especially if we want people to comply with it. So I'm just wondering if you've explored at all hiring a PR firm or doing a much more robust outreach program to try to educate people.
Yes, sir. But I think that the order of operations is reversed there, that we would need the requirement before we began the education. And one of the challenges we have is that we try very carefully not to deviate from what we are authorized to require, because then people just get confused. In fact, what precipitated this night's meeting was a suggestion by Orinda City staff that we begin recommending Zone Zero requirements to residents. And we don't do that. We require, not recommend. There's no shortage of entities and groups sharing information about wildfire risk reduction, to include Zone Zero. CDI and IBHS, among others, have robust outreach and education efforts on that front. I fall back on, however, that with all the outreach and education the city, the town, the fire district, and others have done, we still have a 78% noncompliance rate on initial inspection. So, and the failure rate on reinspection the following year is also well above 50%. So from my perspective, the outreach and education only goes so far, because in the case of reinspection of prior year compliance, they were compliant a year before. They knew what the requirements were and they had done them, right? And maintenance is a much lower bar than initial work. So certainly this is something this major would require significant investment in outreach and education efforts. But I think it would be a critical precursor is to establish what the requirement is and what will there is to act before we begin spreading the word.
Just in follow-up, I think my question was more on, in looking at the hypothetical of, say, the district were to enact this in December and implement as soon as June, that just strikes me as a really quick turnaround to be able to adequately perform outreach so that people could also then do what could be thousands of dollars or more worth of improvements to their properties. I'm just wondering what a realistic timescale would be from implementation through outreach to then presumption of implementation of the measures on homes before you would then have a potential fine.
Yes, sir. I'd point out June wasn't my recommendation. I was answering the question of what's the most aggressive, technically fastest. I will also say, though, on the other side of that, people will take as long as they have. That has absolutely been our experience here. So the question is this, if this is urgent enough to take action, when is it urgent enough to implement? Because our experience is precious few people will do it before the deadline. With regard to our enforcement timeline, the way it works today, which came out of the 2019 Fire Code as part of a negotiation with elected officials who were concerned that residents wouldn't know about these requirements, and recognizing this was a significant change from what we had been doing before, on the order of thousands of inspections per year with only 12,500 residential parcels in the district. So we were hitting about a third of the district every year. So we do a pre-citation, which is not a citation, it's a visit, and documents what needs to be done. Residents have 30 days from receipt of the pre-citation to carry out the changes. If at 30 days the parcel remains non-compliant, we then conduct a reinspection and issue a citation. That has a 14-day performance period. If at the end of those 14 days, the parcel is still non-compliant, so 44 days from the initial inspection, then it's issued a $100 fine and given an additional 7 days. And then we go every week thereafter. But so, and in extraordinary circumstances, people were out of town, couldn't find a contractor, et cetera, we regularly waive everything as long as the work's getting done. But at minimum, it's 44 days from when you receive your pre-inspection with a detailed list of parcel-specific violations that were noted, you have 44 days to get into compliance or to request an extension, which I'm not aware of any extension we've ever denied.
Do we have it? Go ahead.
Renata Sauce, Town of Moraga. Dave, going back to the 5-foot box versus the 2-foot box. So the 5-foot box has the advantage of being recognized by CDI and ergo has some traction with the insurance industry. From a fire science standpoint, all other factors being the same, except the box is 2 feet versus 5 feet. What is the difference from a fire prevention standpoint?
All other factors being equal,
Yes.
2 foot is better than no foot, but it falls below the threshold of being meaningful. And the biggest challenge with 2 foot, particularly with the compromise that allowed the 1 foot up, is that things accumulate there very quickly. And so the parcel could be perfectly maintained and free of combustive material near the home, but it's a wind event is what we're worried about. It's a wind event during the fall when trees are dropping their annual foliage and that foliage is being blown. It accumulates behind the AC unit, behind the trash cans, at the corner where the wind swirls, and the embers will follow those leaves. And so the biggest advantage of 5 feet is that 5 feet gives you enough buffer that when all of those little things that happen that allow fire to find the gap, you have the gap that keeps fire out. And the studies are very clear. If everything that is burning is more than 5 feet from the home is more likely to survive than not. And if the home is ignited, it will take much longer because we're now talking about pyrolysis, about radiant and convective heat assaulting the exterior portion of the home until it either finds the gap or a window fails or it's able to make it into the interior of the house. And all of that time, as I said before, allows us to evacuate the residents and respond the firefighting force that we need to fight the fire. So 2 feet gets us 0 credit, 5 feet gets us 100% credit, and there really isn't a ramp between those two.
And so if I'm understanding, the 5 foot does not include the 1 foot vertical?
5 feet is
5 feet.
Correct. 5 feet is 5 feet and there's no vertical offset.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Letty Kimmel, County Orinda. Chief Winiker, a couple questions. The first is, do we have any data on what percentage within the MOFD district about what percentage of homes sell or transfer every year in terms of how we're achieving compliance?
So during the pandemic, we broke 1,000. We're sitting in the 600 to 800 range now. So all of the homes that sell require a certificate of compliance. So those are all 100%. A couple hundred homes are new construction or major remodel per year. And then we do about 2,000 other inspections in those areas I showed on the map that are MOFD's priority inspection areas, where we're targeting blocks of homes where we believe there's the potential for fire to enter the community.
Okay, so how many parcels in the district did you say?
14,000 total, 12,500 developed residential parcels.
Got it. And for the, sort of pilot program, voluntary compliance, need a whole group. When you mentioned it could, if it's 100 homes or 30 homes, or if a community were to try to get together and, a Firewise community or a regional neighborhood in our district and work with an insurer, right, to achieve voluntary compliance and as a path to reinsurance by admitted carriers, right? Would that require every home in that area of 30 to do this, or would it be, I think you've told us before, there's a percentage?
Up to 85%. Above that, there's not additional value. That said, we're talking about pilots here, and it's extraordinarily unlikely. And the pilot needs to be as small as possible to increase the probability that everyone in that area wants to participate. So for pilot stuff, 100% compliance.
This is Board President Romer. These have all been great questions and very helpful in our deliberations. And I don't want to cut anybody off if there are further questions, but I do think it's important that we take public comment. And then, as I understand the format of this meeting, those of us on the stage here will have an opportunity to discuss and focus upon this issue of whether we are going to be able to get community support for extending our present 2-foot to the 5-foot zone 0? And if so, what that timeline is. So should we open it to public Director Jorgens, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
So Craig Jorgens from MOFD. So Chief, I just have a couple of quick questions, hopefully. So who sets the rates for the FAIR plan?
The FAIR plan does, sir.
So are they subject to the discounts also?
They are, sir.
So all of us that, I don't have it, but all the people that, there are a lot of them now that have the FAIR plan, if they did these things, would qualify for the discounts that they would get if they did harden their homes.
Yes, sir. And as I said before, CDI was very quick to say the formula varies by rate filing and by carrier. FAIR plan is no different, but yes, these discounts are included in the FAIR plan's rate filings.
Okay. And one of the other things that I think is on your CDI list is having non-combustive siding. So you can't have wood siding in your house.
Non-combustive siding within 6 inches of the ground, sir.
Oh, okay. That's a lot easier. Yeah. And you've been around, I know, to a number of communities, Wilder, maybe the Camp Lindo area. What's been the thing, or do you know, what's making them say no? Is it the cost? Is it, gee, I'm not sure I see what the benefit's going to be? You know, what's making them say no?
It's zone 0 has been the element that's hung up. To that point, Wilder's built to 7A and has primarily non-combustive material in place, just with a few fences and some vegetation that's been planted after the community was laid out. Campo is another great example. Firewise done a lot of good things. Zone 0, specifically fences and removal of vegetation. Fences because of cost. And remember, it's only fences only within 5 feet of the structure. It's going to be replaced with a metal gate at below $200, with many opportunities to make that purchase at our local big box stores. And then the vegetation within 5 feet has to do more with the sense of place and the people like how the current state looks. And then the other piece is obviously the community organizing element. Doing that stuff on your own home is daunting. Getting all of your neighbors to do it is particularly daunting. So we have not yet been able to get anyone to do it. And the primary concerns have been change in the status quo, uncertainty, and cost.
And you've been talking to the HOA management, about, for example, at Wilder, about these kind of things.
Yes, sir. Talk to anyone that'll talk to me about it.
Okay. Anything else, or should we proceed to, let's hear from the public? Marcia, do you want to?
So public comment is open. If you wish to speak, if you could please fill out a speaker card. Before we go to the in-person public comment, we did receive 5 written public comments from Scott Whip, Richard Stanley, Juana Rudati, Pete Williams, and Spencer Schilling. These comments were forwarded to the directors and the councils. The comments are also available on our website, and copies have been provided here in the auditorium.
Okay, our first speaker tonight is Jorge Escobar.
Good evening, mayors of Orinda and Moraga, council members, MOFD board, Chief Winokur. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jorge Escobar. My family and I have been residents of Orinda for 38 years. I am a member of the City Finance Advisory Committee in Orinda, co-leader of a Firewise neighborhood, and of the Home Insurance Subcommittee of the Moraga-Orinda Firewise Network. I have had the opportunity to attend 3 of Chief Winokur's recent presentations, the first to the Supplemental Sales Tax Oversight Commission, then to the Firewise neighborhood leaders in Moraga and Orinda, and today's tri-agency meeting. Today, I would like to add my support not only to our current legally mandated abatement requirements by our town, city, and fire district, but also to what a wildfire prepared home is defined as by IBHS. This by starting on a geographic risk level if basis within our communities, if at all possible, and based on science. For instance, Wilder is a low-risk area in Orinda as opposed to several others in the steep slopes and heavily wooded. I do this with a full understanding of the financial and practical challenges for all of us homeowners and our fire district, as well as governmentally for our councils. Moving towards stricter requirements such as to increasing the non-combustible buffer zone from 2 to 5 feet won't be easy, but wildfire hazard conditions have undoubtedly increased as already discussed. What are the alternatives? One, lose our home insurance and go to the last resort, single risk coverage and expensive FAIR plan, requiring a supplemental policy from an insurance company to cover additional risks. By the way, with the plan overwhelmed by demand with the home insurance crisis, its president, Victoria Roach, stated back in March, quote, "We are one event away from a large assessment, and there's no other way to say it, because we don't have the money on hand, and we have a lot of exposure," unquote. In discussing this alternative with a recognized insurance agency in Lafayette, mine, by the way, the FAIR plan maximum, the FAIR plan maximum fire coverage is only $3 million, and there are other limiting considerations in the recent experience as agents. Average premiums for both policies have fluctuated between $7,000 and $13,000, but going all the way to $40,000 in higher risk areas or properties. Another alternative would be to self-insure and deal with the temporary living costs while a property is rebuilt with significant higher construction costs and delays due to increased demand.
Excuse me, sorry. It's been over 3 minutes.
Okay, all right.
Highly appreciated. Can you take about 20 seconds just to sum up?
Okay,
Because
yeah,
we really
sure.
have to make room for other people to speak.
I'll take 20 seconds.
Go ahead.
At Firewise Neighborhoods, we recognize that it is each homeowner's responsibility to take not only the necessary actions to make our property wildfire prepared, but also our adjoining neighborhood and town or city. Okay, it is also with joint, timely, and effective action by our local, county, and state elected officials that we can address these challenges and become safer. Not surprisingly, the 3 candidates for Orinda City Council have made wildfire risk preparation a top priority. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Nick Warnoff.
Good evening. My name's Nick Warnoff. I've lived in Orinda for 22 years. I'm a retired attorney. I've been retired for 10. Many of you know me. I want to initially thank the chief for what I think was one of the finest presentations that I've ever heard at a public body here. It was very thorough and complete. I organized my neighborhood into the first Firewise communities, and I wholeheartedly endorse the chief's suggestion, recommendation for the 0 to 5 foot zone. Director Jorgens mentioned what's the resistance. One of the great benefits from an ordinance is that I'm not speaking from my personal experience, but you have a lot of households where one spouse wants to do the 0 to 5 and one doesn't. And putting an ordinance behind that will resolve those conflicts. But I'm actually here tonight to speak to the town of Moraga. I have a plea to you folks from Moraga. There is a significant chance that the residents of Moraga are going to have to evacuate through Orinda. go through downtown Orinda to get to Highway 24. The Orinda City Council is planning, downtown is already a choke point that's already been established. The Orinda City Council is already planning to add 1,000 housing units downtown in addition to the state mandate.
Restrict our comments to the agenda item here.
There was a question, an evacuation point raised by one of the town of Moraga members. And I
No,
think this.
I understand. I just appreciate if you'd focus. Go ahead.
Pardon me, if I.
Focus on the issue at hand.
I think evacuation is an issue in hand. And I urge you folks from the Moraga Town Council to get involved with the public hearings in the city of Orinda on this very important issue, which will make evacuation very difficult. And I submitted a speaker card with all my contact information. I would be happy to sit down with one or more of you at a lunch before a town council meeting or whatever and give you all the background on this. But the need to evacuate may arise, the need to evacuate through Orinda may arise. And two of these Orinda council members have committed, without even hearing the new evidence, to add these 1,000 units, and there are lives at stake. Please get involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We got a next speaker?
Our next speaker is Bruce Jett.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Bruce Jett, 28-year resident of Orinda, 61 Camino del Diablo. Some of you may have seen me, but sorry, I have a very low voice and it is hard to hear. I'll do the best I can. So just want to thank everybody, all the community participants that have made comments already, but as well as every one of you for all the proactive things you're doing to help make a safer community. I also want to thank Chief Winokur for your great presentation and your service to our communities over the years. We're clearly going to miss you. I think you brought a lot of important issues and worked together with the community to solve those issues. I'm also a landscape architect. I have an office here in Orinda, and we have about 12 or 14 people currently working. And one of the things, if I want to, can I ask questions as much as just make comments or?
Public
Yeah,
to speak, we're limiting to 3 minutes, so it doesn't, so we don't really want to, you can less the question, but don't expect an immediate answer. It might
I
come
understand.
later.
That's great. So one of the projects that we are working on currently is an update to the long-range landscape master plan for Orinda Woods. And as everybody may be familiar with that, it's a combination of single-family homes and townhomes on about 160 acres. You can walk up the street and be there in 5 minutes. And the question I have is, it seems to me that this would be a great test case. Whereas, I mean, we just had a neighborhood meeting that had almost overwhelmingly the major concern. We had two neighborhood meetings. The major concern was fire safety. And the homeowners association has control of everything from right up, not control of some right up to the house necessarily, but they have control all the way down to 24 and out into the wildlands around their community. And I'm just curious, we've already been working with the fire department on that, but I think if we looked at it as a really great test case, I'm sure that that particular HOA would be very interested in working with you. And then the question I have actually, are there any grants? Are there any other sources of funding that we could tap into either as HOAs or as members of the community. And, you know, we could all benefit from those type of grants. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Our next speaker is Charles Conry. Yes, sorry about that.
I'm Charlie Corrick. I live in Moraga. I've lived there since, in Green Valley Manor since 1980. I have two comments. One, I think we're all upset that the insurance companies are looking at California as one entity, as if everybody here lived in paradise. And I think that's angered a lot of us because the risks are very different here than they are somewhere else. I'm concerned that we're doing the same thing here by looking at Moraga as if it was the same as Orinda. And I think it's not for a whole bunch of reasons. So I caution the group here not to consider Moraga as if everybody in Moraga lives on a steep property in Orinda, which is a very different fire risk. And I think differentiating the two towns makes a lot of sense. Secondly, after we had to pay thousands of dollars to comply with the first notice we got on our doorknob, taking out the juniper, doing all this stuff, thousands of dollars re-landscaping, I tried to notice who was in compliance. I get my exercise walking through Moraga neighborhoods. So the best I can tell, maybe 1 out of every 20 homes would pass the 0 to 2, whatever it is, deal. And that's generous. Those that would pass 0 to 5, non-flammable, I probably could count those I've seen on 2 hands. And this includes churches and other things. I think if we go through with this thing here of 0, it's going to be a huge cost to residents. Just think Moraga, maybe you've 4,000 structures there. Our neighbor just sold their house. I think it was $7,000 to $10,000 to comply with the 2 feet. At 0 feet or whatever it is, 5 feet, maybe it's $10,000. If we got like 4,000 properties in Moraga times, I'd say a minimum of $5,000 at 5 feet, maybe it's closer to 10. Just do the math. We're talking $20 to $40 million that you're putting on Moraga residents, just like a property tax. That's what they're going to have to spend when they sell their house, because that's what, to sell your house, you got to pass it. And you think about every home in Moraga that's got a swimming pool, all required to have double gates on any side that can be accessed. Most all of those are wood. All those have got to be replaced. I mean, the costs you're talking about here are really significant. And I'm not sure, I mean, the idea that we're even considering this to me is mind-boggling. I mean, these are huge costs, and it would also change the whole look of Moraga. You go around and look at all the landscaping that makes our neighborhood so beautiful and so pretty. That's all gone. Well, anything within 5 feet, gone. It would be a huge cost to the residents and a huge detriment to the beauty of our community. Those are my thoughts.
Well, sir, you have nailed and focused upon the issue of the day, and I wonder if the next speaker is going to deal with the cost of rebuilding this community if it burns to the ground.
Our next speaker is Kate Hayner.
Hi, Kate Hayner. I live in Orinda and appreciate the opportunity. And thank you, Chief Whitaker, for your excellent presentation. I just really want to strongly encourage you to adopt the CDI recommendations. And personally, it's going to be very hard for me. We have beautiful landscaping around our house. We have to tear out a lot. But when I, on one hand, look at a fire coming through the neighborhood, and then I look at the mitigation, it always comes back to mitigating. And I'm really just thinking about lives, and we know that fire is in our future. And so, and I don't think that it's really going to be enacted unless there are regulations in place. So I'm hoping that you just consider that, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next.
And that concludes our public comment.
Do we have comments from anybody participating remotely?
Comments are in person only.
Okay, gotcha. So then we close public comment and we proceed to a discussion among the electeds up here as to, oh, go ahead.
So I want to start by just saying that Carrie Hillis, Moraga Town Council, we moved to Moraga in 2017. At the time, I was working for a crisis communications firm that was helping a large public utility with some crises that they were encountering. And I can't remember what year it is, and maybe Chief Winokur can remind me. When I was out doing outreach in a community, a far-flung portion of the state, I got a text from my wife that Painted Rock was on fire. And the powerlessness that I felt, knowing that I was hundreds of miles away and my young family was at threat, and showing photos of helicopters dousing fire retardant and wondering if my family would still be there when I got home, is still with me. Since we moved to our new home in Moraga, I would say that we've spent tens of thousands of dollars at this point now to harden outside of Zone 0 for the event to ensure that we're in compliance with MOFD ordinances. We've also done other improvements to our property that are very expensive in recent years that are not in compliance with Zone 0. So I'm just prefacing that with my comment that this is not a question of when Zone 0 is implemented. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. This is going to happen. This is going to happen to save all of our lives. I don't want to be at another business trip across the country or another part of the state and worry if my family is going to still be alive when I get home. The question is whether or not, as the president of MOD mentioned, not the cost of these mitigations, it's the cost of our families. It's the cost of rebuilding our entire community. In 2019, I was at a public safety power shutoff event in wine country, where folks were really upset that their grocery store had some fouling of food because power was shut off. And I'm not minimizing that at all. That's a big deal. Near the end of the event, everyone's phone started going off. And that was paradise. I then had to go and do some outreach in Paradise for the survivors of Paradise in Chico. And the pain that I saw from the people as they walked through the door was evident. And the message that was received was, why didn't you do something to ensure this didn't happen? And it wasn't the company I was working for, it was me personally. Well, in this context, all of us at these tables have the opportunity to do something to ensure, for one, my family's still alive if I have to go out on a business trip and a wildfire comes through. So for me, this is incredibly personal, and I can understand the expense. La Morinda is an extravagantly expensive community to live in. And we all moved here for a reason for the most part. We moved here for our kids, for the schools. None of that matters if everything burns down. So again, the question is not if, but when. And I would also say, to the point that we are also facing another burden from the state of California with our RENA numbers. This is not a choice. This is a requirement, just like MOFD. If they came through and they issued a citation because things weren't done, you have to do that. If you don't do that, MOFD will do it for you, and then they will put a lien on your house. The state of California is no different. If we don't build the housing that we're required to do, we could lose control of our zoning. It could be handled by a judge. We could be fined $100,000 a month while we try to get into compliance. And then the housing is built anyway. If we don't have a compliant housing element, then we could be subject to the builder's remedy, where then they can not even pay attention to what our zoning is at all. So given that we have these cross currents here, where we are required in Moraga, including the buffer, where we were just recently required to zone for an additional 1,800 homes in a cul-de-sac community. Orinda, I'm sure, faces a similarly high number, probably even higher, given that there is BART station there. What I would say is, again, not if this is going to happen, when. I would also just say, as we come to these discussions on the when this is going to get enacted by MOFD, I would say the next question is again on timing. So several of us here serve on the Recycle Smart Board of Directors for garbage, far less consequential in some ways than MOFD. But when the state went through implementation for composting, we have compost cops that go out and open bins for inspection. And if the compost hasn't been put properly in the right garbage can, there's a little, educational brochure pamphlet that goes forward. It's not always going to be educational. At some point, it's going to be more than that. Everything is in implementation. How you can get folks to actually be able to understand why this is being done, how you can communicate what look at what I would say East Bay Mud does, and I'll wrap this up. When we're in drought, they provide examples of what beautiful landscaping can look like that is compliant. We had a family home in Tucson, and I don't imagine that La Morinda will ever look like Tucson. And there has to be a way that we can do this so that folks really, all of us included, we're all volunteers, can ensure that all of our homes can also look beautiful. The essence of this is an implementation in time. So thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Rena.
Renata Sauce, Town of Moraga. First of all, I want to thank the members of the public who have come out here to hear the presentations and provide your input. Your input is always important, and we listen and we hear you. And I want to thank the people who wrote in and the people who have commented all along the line on fire safety issues. And I want to thank Chief Winokur. You're a lame duck, but you're not behaving like one. You could be mailing it in at this point, and yet you are here vociferously advocating for the safety of the public in our two communities. And I very, very much appreciate that. So all of us sitting around this table share the commitment to public safety and to the safety of our families and our children, our seniors, everyone in our communities. And I believe that we should be leaders on this, and that we should not follow, but that we should be leaders, and we should act, and we should not wait for a catastrophe in our community to do something. So I want to urge the MOFD board to adopt the Zone Zero requirements into our code. And I would, consistent with what my colleague Carrie Hillis said, I would do it though on a timeline that allows for public outreach, that allows for public education, that allows for people to do some financial planning, that allows for coming up potentially with some funding to assist those who are financially burdened and unable to comply. And so what I would urge would be adoption right away to allow for voluntary compliance prior to the deadline, to let people have more options in the insurance markets, but then not do enforcement until I'm just going to throw out 18 months from now, so that there is the opportunity for all the things that I mentioned. I know in 2019 that the 5-foot requirement was controversial, and I remember that. But this is a different time. That was before orange skies, smoke-filled communities, communities leveled to the ground. And it's a very, very different landscape 5 years later. And I believe that our community believes it is time to take action and expects us to take action. So I would like to put our residents in the position to have more insurance options, and I'd like to put our communities in a better position to withstand wildfire. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa Onoda, Mayor of Moraga. And I guess we're just going to go down the line. It looks like maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I've been in the unique position where we have evacuated. I live on Merrill Circle, and Merrill had a fire. Some au pairs were walking at midnight, just having a good time. However, they were also vaping, and the vape thing got hot. She threw it on the ground, and poof, up it went. And the electricity was out at that particular time. And so imagine that. And the hill across from us was completely inflamed. And a neighbor came by our house at like midnight and hammered on the door because he noticed that both of our cars were still in the driveway. He was barefoot. He had his children in the car and his wife in the car. And my husband got up, answered the door, saw the hills, on fire, and there was no question, So we have our to-go bags next to our front door, and and a note to grab one other thing besides the cats and the dog. And so that's kind of a reality check. And I encourage the MOFD board to help us and to have the residents go for the 5 foot. It's not going to be easy in every house. In fact, I have a person who's coming in December to plan ours and move ours 5 feet from the house. I think that we have to realize where we live, and we love where we live. Every person that speaks, they talk about first thing, how long they've lived here. And we all know that, but I think that we have to imagine a new way of living here. And that's up to you folks to make that happen. One other thing is, I guess that's it. So thank you everybody for coming and those people that are listening. And I'm sure that there's pushback. This one gentleman from Moraga, he doesn't feel that way, and that's okay. And it's great that he got to come and voice his opinions, and he won't be alone. But I think our job is safety. Your job is safety first. So thank you very much.
Steve Wallachy, also of Moraga. And I also thank everybody participating tonight, and I'm going to make that a short thank you. I guess my first message is that, change is difficult. And an analog that I can think of is wood shake roofs. They used to be pretty much the norm. And in my neighborhood in Moraga, in fact, they were required. And there are still neighborhoods that do require these. But at least in our neighborhood, and I think in general, people are moving away from the roofs. And, they've learned that they're a fire hazard, no longer being used. I believe that the costs of these mitigations are attractive compared to the insurance rates that we're going to all be facing, the lack of insurance, and the impact of fires. I believe that a challenge with this is really stakeholder engagement. And I'm not sure exactly where the responsibilities for that are going to reside, but go by examples, compelling arguments, the WIFM principle, which is what's in it for me. And also to be able to communicate to the residents what truly is the cost of each of these modifications that are going to be required. It's unclear to me as to whether MOFD or the town is responsible for this. Probably both. He's taking responsibility. Okay, good.
Buck stops here.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Chief, clarify this, Chief, if you could. We can regulate the 5 foot, but we can't force you to fill in your eaves and do all the other things, right?
Yes, sir.
Other than
The
with
question is
fire
whether
code.
it's subject to the building code or to the exterior hazard abatement ordinance. Building code items such as vents, siding, windows, et cetera, are considered conforming or compliant if they met the code that was in place at the time they were installed. So we currently, through the very high fire hazard severity zone and the WUI fire area designation require 7A construction that includes all the built environment components for any new construction or major remodel that's classified as a new construction by the county building official. But we can't require those retroactively. That's why our vent mesh and so forth, that's a voluntary program. Fences less than 7 feet, we do have the authority to regulate, however.
Anyway, those are things that have to be decided or agreed to. It would help to have the updated hazard maps, because that might be part of the message to convince people the necessity of doing this. And I think Chief Winokur might have proposed that maybe we require it very soon for homes that are up for sale and major remodels. I think that's as a minimum, and then maybe a schedule to allow people to implement this over time. And I profess, or I pledge that I'm on my way to meeting Zone Zero, starting with the fences to myself. Thank you.
I'm going to take a slightly different tone because it's not just one gentleman from Moraga who thinks this is too much and too expensive.
And if you can just state your name.
Oh, I'm sorry, Brandon Iverson, City Council Orinda. I might have a spouse who begged me not to be yet another overzealous, overregulating, let's do everything right now. Let's be the very first to adopt things. People are a little tired of that. And I would also point out that there is probably no correlation between passing this regulation and changing insurers' minds that they'll automatically see that we're compliant, see what good people we are, change their mind. I also knew that tonight was going to be mostly a room full of true believers, and that most of the doubters and the people who really don't want to change all of their very expensive landscaping aren't here for this conversation. And with all of that said, I changed my mind because I think Chief Winokur's presentation tonight was incredibly persuasive. And what changed my mind were a few statements. One, that evacuation is not necessarily going to solve our problems, and that the best thing we can do is to be the safest community we can be. I was in Piedmont on Friday watching the Oakland fire, and it didn't spread. I stayed in my office and watched the traffic. Traffic didn't back up. That fire stayed contained because a lot of things went right. You also mentioned that people will take all the time you give them, and that, 7 years of asking people to do the right thing and educating and all of our Measure R dollars, pounding people over the head with information doesn't change behavior. Enforcement does. And the enforcement regimen is a very respectful one. It gives people a compliance period. It gives people then the citation and more time to comply. The fines are not overwhelming. And so I feel like it's a really balanced way of creating change that is frankly our job to keep this place safe in the best way we can. So on that, I do support the measure, and I think it's a tough one.
Hi, Inga Miller, City of Orinda City Council member. And I start out by sharing that, I share all the fears about fire. I too have those personal experiences, and I've been in that moment, and it's time to leave. Said that. Look at them. It's time to go. And it's a powerful, it's a very emotional time, right? And we were all here in 1991. I'm also very, very, there's something I'm more afraid of, I will say, and that's of fear. And as Winston Churchill said, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. Fear is a powerful motivator. And we as public officials have to be very careful about how we use fear in our community. And I heard it used when the gentleman, Charles, came to the dais and he left, and our chair said, well, I want to know how you feel after how much it costs to rebuild the town of Moraga, because the idea of a city burning down is terribly scary. And can that happen? Yes. May it happen? Yes. And so the question I have for everyone here, and I don't have the answers. I don't pretend to know the answers, but I think there's a lot of information that people here need to investigate and to get to the bottom of before making decisions here, about, not necessarily here, but with regard to the decisions being made about what is within our control as city officials. There's some that's simply not. That's really up to your board, and it's up to you to decide. One of the things I'm often asked about is, but what would our community be like if these regulations that are not being enforced today, some parts of the regulation, I don't know if MOFD's, if that's within the 50%, the 2023 regulations, I don't know if those are being enforced yet. Okay. Whether or not, but there's a huge amount that of what we heard that's not being enforced at this point. And if our community is enforcing that, what does our community look like? What does it feel like? And how does it respond to us? An example that I do hope people are thinking about are the hillsides, because we don't talk about hillside landslide insurance because most of us don't have it. And we've had tragedies in our community in the last couple of years with houses coming down the hill. And, if you come by my hillside, we have been forced, we do comply. I'm on the city council. We have removed all of the stabilizing plants that are on our hillside to comply with the ordinances. So this isn't just about the zone 0. What the chief is saying is that all of those other ordinances must be fully in place for this to work. So we're having a drying of our soils. Unlike Marin, our ordinance does not allow for fire-safe mulch. So we can't keep our soils moist. And that's something in Orinda that we've really had a change in the environment. We had one of the early slides, I'll just point you to is, and I'm sorry taking so much time, I'm almost finished, but because it's really food for thought. I don't think there is an answer. I think these are things that the community has to decide. It had to do with the aeration, the aridness. We're becoming more arid, so things are drying out quicker. So we're having this pavement effect. New build stuff is having a ton of pavement. It's going to come down into our drains. Anyway, but that's making us hotter. It's going to be, it's a whole ecosystem. And I think there are things that we can be doing, like fire safe mulch and things to keep the water in the soil, to keep our temperatures down, that type of thing. And I'm just concerned about going too fast without asking the questions. I love the idea, the landscape architect who came and talked about Orinda Woods. Wouldn't it be amazing if Orinda Woods was willing to offer itself to come into this compliance? They have irrigated landscaping beyond. So they're mostly flat. They have that arid hillside, but they're mostly flat. So they have a huge amount of irrigation, and they can actually comply with this to find out if an insurer would insure their community. It would be a phenomenal opportunity. So I think following up on that right away is wonderful. It may be that Moraga is a place to do this because, but anyway, so I do think it's important to take a thought about those things. Thank you.
Darlene G., City of Orinda. Again, I'd like to thank you, Chief Whitaker. I've seen a lot of your presentations. This was certainly at the top. I'm well convinced of the fire science, and I'm very, very deeply concerned about public safety. And I'm someone that, like a lot of you, has done so many of the things we've all been talking about. My gutters, my vents, my, let's see, my husband's on his second go around of using the chipper in a month. So, I mean, all of these things are so important, but I also recognize how easy it is to say this and how hard it's going to be to implement it. I am quite concerned even about how this could be enforced. It doesn't seem to me like as hard as MOFD tries, we're not really keeping completely up with the enforcement, I don't think. I am worried. I do think the community is going to have, the communities are going to have a lot of pushback. I think we're very scared about fire, and rightfully so. And I think it's top of mind probably for everyone. And I do think people, want to see a more fire safe community. I do think also right now that the tone in the community is, a lot of us have worked really, really hard. A lot of people have worked really hard on their individual properties. I look at all of the information we have pumped out and pumped out and pumped out to all of these highly intelligent people. And I had dinner with my son and daughter-in-law last night who live in Orinda and were not signed up for the community warning system. So, I mean, I made them sign up right at the dinner table, but I just, I'm afraid that so much of the zealousness of what we have tried to accomplish, we all have to remember has resulted in huge amounts of insurance cancellations. I think the tone and tenor of how people are feeling in this community right now is pretty harsh. I mean, in terms of, so I just don't want us to underestimate what the reaction is going to be of, we did all this stuff. A lot of us did. A lot of us worked hard to be in Firewise communities, and we got our insurance canceled, and we've supported everything we can think of. And now you're telling us if we just, make this 0 to 5 feet zone, everything will be wonderful. And I just don't want us to underestimate how hard that's going to be. I'm not saying I wouldn't be supportive, and I'm, pained at looking at my own house and what I'd be tearing out. Okay. So I'm not saying I wouldn't support it for the good of the community, but am saying that I think it's easy to sit up here and say it's a great idea. It's going to be hellacious to try to get the community to buy into this. And I'm very confused as to how we would actually really get this enforced. That just seems mind-boggling when you look at the number of properties and the number of resources. So.
I want to thank everyone here for a lot of thoughtful comments.
You just want to state your name.
Oh, sorry, Lathika Mulkani, City of Orinda. I see this becoming a requirement down the road. I do. I see perhaps even the state going down this path. This was an incredibly persuasive presentation. So thank you again, Chief Winokur, and I think to all of, to Councilmember Iverson's comments, I thought were fabulous, and they sort of inform my viewpoint, which is that I want, thank you to all of you who came. I want every one of our residents in that MOFD fire district, in an ideal world, should hear this presentation to help them understand, right? To change, because what we're talking about is an incredibly onerous thing that we're asking folks to do, right? And I want to see everyone do it because, I'm going back to what I think was one of the most convincing things that you shared tonight, Chief Winokur, is, when you were asked about, or when the topic of evacuation came up, right? And one of the best things we can do is to harden our homes and to remove that vegetation and create this zone 0 so that the fire doesn't spread, right? We want to control that spread so that the firefighters can get to us, so the fire doesn't get too hot and too out of control, because that's what will save, property, but more importantly, will save lives, right? But the rub in that is that to get there, every single resident, every single building, every single homeowner needs to do their part. And that is an expensive, it's going to be an expensive pill to swallow. So a couple suggestions. One is to start as we did, right? In terms of, I guess I see us going down this path, but I am concerned. I don't know that we can go down it on the most aggressive approach in terms of the timing, because I think it's very, very, very important that there be adequate opportunity for education and public comment, right? And for input. And also, so starting perhaps with imposing these zone 0 5 foot with properties that are turning hands, that are remodeling, right? And I'm really concerned about the financial cost and the financial burden on some of our residents. But so I'd like to see just more communication and this done and explored in a manner that everyone is allowed to really provide input. But having said that all, I do think it's something that, I am persuaded that it's something that we're going to have to do, because, again, it a lot of us have been in situations where we've either seen fire or, and I do also think we do have to be careful of fear as being a motivator and making sure that we're making common sense decisions without reacting in an emotional manner. But I do think it's the right balance.
Janet Riley, Orinda City Council. Being the last of however many voices tonight, you've all said really valid things. I really agree with a lot of it. I still have some mixed feelings, and in my circle, my world, they're all very intelligent and they understand this risk, but doing it and making that effort to make their gardens, not so beautiful, or to spend that money to make something ugly and make it hard and rocky and, dry and ugly. I mean, sounds like the right thing to do, but who wants to do that? So a lot of people aren't ready to take the action in my circle, I'd say. And even if they heard this powerful, persuasive talk, they would go away thinking, as I am, okay, so how am I going to accomplish this? This is a lot of money and a lot of time, and I value what I have, and how am I going to create something just as beautiful, with $100,000 that I'm going to be happy and proud of and pleased with. So anyway, the enforcement issue beyond just someone valuing the beauty of their garden also concerns me with the older people. There's so many older people who are on, of course they're not, most of them are just on a more fixed income. They have a more limited amount of money. So they are more concerned about bigger outlays of money because they don't have so much money coming in. And it takes a lot of work and effort. And when you're, an elderly senior couple or single, it's hard just to pay the gardener. It's hard to do a lot of things that we do, we do 10 things in 1 minute all the time. But, and I think we have a large senior population. So attacking this and getting people to not only think about it differently, but actually take action is, it really hasn't worked so far. So I would say that it needs to be re-examined how we could change people's, help people actually make change, take action. Thank you.
Thank you. I think then the MOFD board members have the opportunity, but not the obligation to make comments. And it looks like Director Jorgens has raised his hand first.
I'll go first. I'm not sure it's going to be overly organized, but Craig Jorgens from MOFD. So thank you again, Chief, for a great presentation. I've seen it a bunch of times, and I know I was involved in hiring you because you wanted to be proactive, not just reactive. And I think that's the question we all have for ourselves. And I think I heard a bunch of people, especially on this side, want to be especially proactive and be leaders. And it's funny because they're in what tonight was described as the less risky area, and we're from the area that's more risky. And I'm from Orinda. So I would have expected the positions to be a little different, but I think everybody, and most people at least, ended up being supportive of the concept. I agree it's an implementation challenge. I agree there are, older demographics that might need. So it's not only an education, but it might be a support question. It might be a how do you not only enforce it, but how do you incentivize it, and how do you facilitate it if you need to give grants to people that can't afford it or give loans to people that can't afford it. There are ways to get around some of those things, but those are implementation challenges. I agree. It's not just a matter of economics that we talked a lot about the savings you're going to have in insurance or the fact you're going to actually get insurance. But in reality, the number one thing this does is make your house not burn down. So you don't care about insurance if your house doesn't burn down because you still have your house. So for me, and that means you're also safe. And those older people we're worried about don't die in their homes because, a lot of them are infirmed and can't necessarily get out easily. And unless they know their neighbors, which is part of the whole Firewise thing, to be able to know which neighbors need help getting out, they're the ones that are actually the most at risk from all of this because they're the ones that are going to be the last ones out. We don't have the facilities. The fire department, the police department don't have the facilities to get those people out. So making the community not burn down is actually really important from a proactive standpoint and just from a safety standpoint. It potentially precludes evacuations, but at least it makes the evacuations less critical. Even if you still need to do it, it's not as critical that you get out quite as, it gives you a little more time to get out if nothing else. So for me, my wife's in a couple of garden clubs, as a matter of fact, so not to make this personal, but and she's the other half of the family. I might tell you that, it's sort of, and we've done, and the community, just so we're clear, in the last 7 years, both of our communities have done an amazing amount of work. We've had the chippers work basically full time for years now doing that. We've taken out thousands of cubic yards of material. So we have made the community safer. Is it enough safer? No, but it's a lot safer than it used to be. And we've taken away the juniper. We've done a lot of things. And we spend money on safety all the time. We put up stop signs. We put yellow lines down the middle of roads. We do a lot of things as a community and spend money and enforce laws on a regular basis to make people safer, as does the state and everybody else. But this is something that we can control ourselves, and we can educate our particular community and make our community safer. There aren't that many opportunities you get to make something dramatically different without hiring a whole lot of extra policemen or something. So I'm supportive of this. I've been supportive of prevention from the very beginning, since, ever since I got on the board. And this is the last step. I get that, but I think we have been leaders in the whole state. The chief, and there's a gentleman here that can, as a third party, give us, I think maybe if we wanted to, some explanation of what our chief really does in the not only our community, but in the county and in the state in particular. And our community is the leader in the state on these things. And our chief is the leader in the state on these things. So on prevention and on insurance and lobbying with the insurance companies, on understanding how the fires propagate. So, and this is what he's going to keep doing when he retires from being a fire chief, by the way. So for me, this is the last step. It's a big step. It's a step that's going to have to be implemented relatively slowly, or thoughtfully, I guess, not necessarily slowly. And we can start with things like the new homes that transfer or the new construction and things, which have to meet almost all these codes other than the 5 feet anyway. So, and I think there are a few homes around that already meet these standards, and they don't look horrible. They don't look like you're living in Arizona. In reality, the biggest cost is putting the vegetation back. Getting rid of it isn't that expensive. So you can do it slowly. You can get rid of all of it at relatively low expense. Chainsaws are cheap. Looks horrible for a while. It's the putting back that's the harder part, but because bare ground counts. So you don't have to spend money to fix it. You just have to spend money to get rid of the current problem. So it doesn't have to be as expensive. So I'm supportive of it, I guess is the bottom line.
Thank you. Steve?
Steve Danziger, MOFD. I appreciate the comments of everybody. Financial, our seniors, evacuations. My wife and I are master gardeners, so Councilmember Riley, we'd be right with you as far as the vegetation goes. And what what Kerry said too, it's not if, it's when. I have a lot of questions, and ultimately, this decision is going to be by this board, and the chief will, I'm supportive of the chief presenting it to the board and let us go from there. I can't go into all my questions right now because they're still formulating, but I have many, many questions, and I'm supportive of the board taking it on and discussing those. I know there'll be a lot of pushback. I want to hear from more residents once this gets out. I'm sure, already for this meeting, I mean, all of us had emails and I've been stopped by residents around the area that I live, especially in walking this weekend in the Ivy Drive area of Orinda. I talked to a lot of people and I didn't find anyone who supported it right, just talking to people, neighbors, anybody. So there will be a lot of pushback on it, but I support it coming to the board and let us deal with whatever we need to do. It doesn't have to happen in, I heard someone say 18 months. I mean, our removal of juniper and bamboo, I think that was a 2 or 3, was it 2? 3. So people had 3 years to remove their bamboo and juniper, and we still have people to this day who we're still dealing with them. They still haven't done it. So, we could hypothetically, once we have a discussion, we could be talking 3 years or maybe more. I don't know. But I'm in favor of it coming to the board and having further discussion on it. So.
Greg Hassler, MOFD. One, I wanted to thank Chief Winokur and the audience for being here, but I also want to thank the city council for the honest feedback, right? Very candid and honest feedback. And that's what I think we need as a MOFD, is to hear from people, and we need to hear feedback from all points of view, because like people have realized, even though tonight I think we heard a fairly constant point of view from the audience, I don't think that is this case across the community. So I think tonight was a good start. I think that we as MOFD have the obligation to think through this very carefully about how it would impact our community and work with the communities on it. The timing is the issue and the outreach is the issue. I'll be honest. I took my junipers out in January. So I got a flyer on my door, and that's the first, I'm newer on the board. It's the first I'd ever heard about it. So outreach is slow. And those people in the know hear it, and other people hear it when they get a hanger on their door, and they probably aren't as prepared as other people for this. They obviously, a fire would be lit under them if their insurance is canceled, and they'll be asking us why we didn't do something sooner. And so it's a complicated issue. I don't think we can make light of it, that it's an easy issue. So I think I'm with Director Danziger in that I think it's important for the board to go through it, and I think it's important to implement it in an organized fashion that is most beneficial for the community, so the community understands what we're doing and receive the feedback from them.
Change is always hard. I remember how hard we worked when we upgraded our fire code, but it was right at the decision at the time, and it's made big headways. I'm in favor of taking it on because I think it's just the next step in the process of creating a much more safe community. So I would be supportive of it.
And just for the record, and that was Director Jex speaking.
And finally, this is MOFD Board President Mike Romer, and I want to thank everybody for their comments. I deeply appreciate not only what you've thought about, but the emotion behind it. everybody here, including everyone in our community in the audience. And I'll apologize in advance if I get a little emotional here, but I'm going to make some personal comments to me. And I want to tell everybody that I'm deeply, deeply saddened that I think that there's absolutely nothing that the MOFD board can do to keep Dave Winokur as our fire chief for another 25 years. He deserves well-deserved applause for the presentations that he gives tonight and on every occasion before this board. But for the entire tenure of his service to our community, he has exemplified what it means is by the word leadership. All of us as elected officials, I think, know what it means to read letters to the editor, read comments in public that call into question your motivations, call into question whether you're doing the right thing for the right reasons. And I happen to know that for every time that Dave Winokur gets kudos for what he does, behind the scenes, it's incredibly demoralizing to be threatened with lawsuits, to have his motivations questioned, and to persist in the face of all of that to try to do what he knows is right for the community. I think that's an example that we should live by. I agree that it's with the other comments here, that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when we upgrade our ordinances. It's not a question of whether, but how fast we do it. And we all realize that it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. It's going to be expensive, and we're never going to get 100% buy-in. We may not get 90% buy-in. But I think if we get, what is it, 70% compliance, that the rest of something like that, something between 70 and 85%, that the ones that we don't get are going to piggyback on those of us who do. And that may be the best that we can expect. It's tough to be the bad guy. It's tough to enact tough ordinances. But as I look out on this audience here, I see the future of this community, and I see Jeff Isaacs and Lucas Lambert and Gordon Graham and all the enforcement team on MOFD. And I know that these are not just people with our best interests at heart who know our ordinances, but they're very decent human beings. And they don't jam things down people's necks. They give people second and third and fourth and fifth chances to comply with our ordinances. So I have a lot of trust in the people that we have hired, the people that we entrust with enforcing our ordinances. So I'm willing to take the chance that if the community decides that they don't want to reelect me, they no longer appreciate my service on the board, that's okay. That if I can show leadership and if I can be part of a team that inspires this community to do what may be an example to the rest of the state, that one term will be good enough for me. So I do think that we need to be cognizant of people's needs, that change be measured and reasonable, and that ordinances are enforced with compassion and empathy and with forgiveness for mistakes. But I do think that if we don't do this, it's going to be done to us. It's going to be done to us by the greenhouse gases that are filling our atmosphere, by the reinsurance companies that are looking at our changing climate, and by the insurance companies that are just not going to go bankrupt if their regulations are, if the risk is too high. So I think that we have to work with the companies that we have. And I think that we have I'm very proud to say that I think that we have great people in MOFD that I trust to enforce the ordinances that we collectively decide on whatever timeline we decide in order to make this happen. So again, I thank everybody for their comments. Appreciate our community. And if Chief Winokur would like to close with some comments.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I just thank you, the directors and the council members, for your participation, your feedback. I think we have received not only the interest in this, but the concern about the manner. Obviously, the devil is in the details. And we have this enormous problem, which we could look at as an elephant. And you eat an elephant one bite at a time. And we're not going to be able to just from strictly the mechanics of how many people we have and how long it takes to get to how many parcels. It would not be possible to do something all at once. So we will endeavor to put together a thoughtful proposal that we'll bring forward to the MOFD board. And then obviously, I suspect there'll be far more community interest in an adoption of an ordinance than there was in a discussion of the topic. And we'll sort through obviously the public comment and endeavor to work with the city manager and the town manager to ensure all the voices are being heard. So we thank you all very much for taking the time and providing the input. And then I would suggest Director Romer, you could entertain a motion to adjourn, close the meeting.
I will do so.
We adjourn.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
I don't know that we need a vote. I think we're adjourned, aren't we?
Say all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Time is 8:45.